On the other hand, if you take a boat from the coast of Aberdeen, Scotland, and head straight out east into the icy seas of the North Sea, you will arrive at your destination after a considerable period of time has passed. There is a possibility that you will not see anything at all for a length of time that might range anywhere from 7 to 8 hours, depending on the conditions of the weather and the speed of your boat. This is something that you should be prepared for. After then, the waves will start to move in the direction of the horizon, and as they do so, a structure will start to emerge from the water surrounding them. The initial examination reveals that it appears to be a one-of-a-kind structure that is made up of bones that are rigid. On the other side, as you draw closer, you discover that it is a large island that was made by people out of steel. It appeared as though a skyscraper and a construction site had been combined into a single structure, and then that structure was erected on top of enormous metal stilts that plunged 100 feet into the black water below. Overall, the site was quite impressive. It was in the year 2000 that this particular oil rig, which is located offshore, was given the name Magellan. The year 2000 was also the year that it was given that name. The Magellan was essentially a city because of its location in the midst of the ocean, which made it a very strategic location. In addition to its principal aim, which was to extract crude oil from deep beneath the seabed, it was always buzzing and humming with activity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This was the case during the whole operation. The people that operate on these rigs are a completely different breed from anything else in the world. The individuals who fall within this category are both male and female. Roughnecks are individuals who live and work on these isolated platforms. They commonly spend weeks, and sometimes even months at a time during their life. Roughnecks are referred to as living and working on these isolated platforms. Roughnecks are seen rather frequently in the United States of America. When compared to the various vocations that are available in the world, this particular one is among the most hazardous ones. The act of walking across a deck is considered to be a calculated risk, because every outdoor surface is always slippery and covered in a layer of oil or salty spray. This is the case even for something as simple as strolling across a deck. This is because every surface is an external surface. This is the reason why this is the case. In the aftermath of a fall, there is a chance that the injury will be devastating. It is possible to lose your balance and fall from a higher platform into a lower one, which could potentially result in your death. These two scenarios are both feasible. There is a chance that this will occur. Additionally, there is the risk that you could completely fall off the rig, which would result in a fall of 100 feet into the churning and cold water below. This would be a very dangerous situation. When the notoriously terrible weather of the North Sea, which is characterized by gale force gusts and heavy showers, is taken into consideration, the likelihood of falling is significantly enhanced during the course of the day. With that being said, this is not the only risk that is pertinent to this situation. It is something that is extremely flammable, and that is crude oil, which is the same thing that they are there to obtain. They are present in order to achieve this goal. In the event that even a single spark were to be positioned in the wrong location, it has the potential to result in a catastrophic inferno that would present no escape route from the predicament. In addition, there is a phenomenon that is referred to as a blowout, which occurs when the high-pressure well that they are drilling into abruptly and violently explodes without any prior warning. The occurrence of this is something that is a possibility. Even though there are safety protocols that have been installed on rigs in an effort to prevent this from happening, it is likely that those systems will not be enough if you are in close proximity to the drill when it occurs. This is because the presence of the drill might potentially cause you to be injured. Being a roughneck is related with a number of risks that are severe and persistent at all times, regardless of the circumstances. On a consistent basis. On the other hand, the benefits are substantially more significant, and for the vast majority of people, it comes down to a single aspect, which is the most important. Quite surprisingly, the recompense is made available. In the year 2000, Gordon Moffat, a man who was 41 years old at the time, was regarded as one of these roughnecks. He was thought to be a roughneck. On the Magellan crew, he was a player. he was a member of the crew. In addition to being a husband and a father to 2 children, he was also a father to 2 children. Gordon was also a father to 2 children. Certainly, he was not the type of person who sought thrills in any way. The majority of the men who worked on the rig did so for the same reason, which was to improve their own living conditions. This was done so that they could provide a good life for their families who lived on land. This dangerous job was something that he did for the same reason that he worked in others. The thought of his wife and children, as well as the future he was constructing for them, made the hardship of his absence worthwhile. He was building in the future for them. Over the course of a considerable amount of time, he was absent. Nonetheless, the mere concept of them made the absence worthwhile. To provide a more precise explanation, he was employed for the role of a maintenance specialist for the drill mechanism itself. The fact that these enormous and intricate pieces of machinery represent the basis of the business does not change the fact that they are prone to encountering problems on a fairly consistent basis. Additionally, the drilling company is suffering financial losses for each and every minute that the drill is not spinning in order to produce the results that are necessary. This is because the drill is not spinning. A chunk of money like that is not insignificant at all. The rig had a rule that was not written down but was recognized by everyone. If the drill stopped, it was your obligation to fix it. This rule was not written down. A written record of this rule did not exist. All of that happens instantly. No matter what time of day it was, whether it was 3 in the morning or the middle of the following day, the circumstance did not change in any way. The outcome was the same, regardless of whether the weather was calm or a storm was raging. There was no difference in terms of the outcome. It was essential to take immediate action in order to discover a solution to the problem that had been presented. On the evening of October 9th of that year, Gordon had just concluded a long shift that had been quite stressful. He had just finished his shift. Just a moment ago, he had been relieved of the duties associated with his shift. The statement that he was worn out was accurate. Within the limits of this floating steel island, he had made his way back to his modest chambers, which were the only personal space he had accessible to him. He had been there for quite some time. It was difficult to move around in his accommodations, and there was a notable lack of furniture. It was highly probable that the only thing he was looking forward to was a piping hot meal and probably a brief phone call to his family before retiring for a few hours throughout the night. He had just finished taking off his heavy work boots, and he was now looking forward to getting some rest and relaxation. Despite this, the relatively tranquil atmosphere of his chamber was disrupted by the crackling sound of his radio, which occurred just as he was beginning to rest. This was a significant event. Instantaneously, he became conscious of a voice that was speaking to him and pleading with him to listen. On the contrary, the circumstances were not at all favorable. At that time, the fitness routine came to a complete end. In order to fulfill the criteria, he had to return to the deck. Gordon was a seasoned roughneck, so he was accustomed with this circumstance and did not find it strange. This was because he had been in this situation before. In spite of the fact that it was a source of annoyance, it was a vital component of the task that needed to be completed. His life had been filled with a significant number of late-night phone calls, and he had received a significant number of these calls during the course of his life. The protesting that was done in response to the circumstance was nothing more than a waste of time. In light of this, he stood up, put on his work clothes, and made his way out the door, returning to the chaos and the chilly, windy night that they had been enjoying. He did this with a deep sigh. Following that, he went back inside. In the process of arriving at the main deck, which was the focal point of the rig's major operations, Gordon came across a scene that was both disorganized and well-organized, and it had a purpose. The main deck is a massive open metal platform, and right in the midst of it is where the big drill assembly goes through the floor on its journey to the ocean, which is placed an incredible distance below. The ocean is located at a staggering distance below. The area beneath the platform is where the ocean can be found. Many of his coworkers, including a few of them, were waiting for him to arrive. The bulk of them were waiting for him. They expeditiously communicated to him the most recent information that was available concerning the matter, Specifically, the problem was with some cabling that was situated just beneath the main deck. This is some further information. The fact that these wires on the main deck itself were not accessible was the root cause of the problem. This was due to the fact that it was unable to access them. On the level that was directly below the one that was being accessed, there was a point of access that was located. They had done this process a large number of times in the past, despite the fact that it was quite tough to carry out. This was something that they had done a great deal of times in the past. When it came to maintenance, it was a straightforward task. In accordance with the plan, Gordon was intended to take an elevator down one level in order to arrive at the platform that was located directly below the main deck. To begin, the crew on the main deck would first take a safety harness that was attached to a long, durable cable. After that, they would feed the harness down to him through a small access hole that was situated in the floor of the main deck. The upper deck would be the location where this would take place. These little service ports on rigs are referred to as mouse holes, which is the phrase that is used to describe this particular hole. Additionally, this particular hole is referred to as a mouse hole by its name. It was estimated that the diameter of the thing that was being discussed was approximately 10 inches. In the case that Gordon found himself on the lower deck, he would look up, see the harness coming down through the mouse hole, and then he would grab it and put it on instead of the mouse. That would be his plan. In order to guarantee that it was tightly attached, he would wrap it around his waist for that purpose. Next, he would give the crew on the main deck a signal, a thumbs up, so that they could see him plainly through the gap. This would allow them to see him more clearly. Each and every one of them had a clear view of him. Once they had finished their turnaround, they would send a signal to the hoist operator, who was also a member of the crew. This would indicate that they were ready to continue. The individual who was in charge of operating the hoist was situated in a small control cab that was situated slightly above and behind the team that was working on the main deck. When the hoist operator was standing, he was unable to view Gordon or the mouse hole because of the nature of his position. This was the case because of the nature of his position. He had no idea what he was doing and relied solely on the messages that were being communicated by the crew that was aboard the main deck. He was utterly uninformed about what he was doing. Additionally, it was his responsibility to operate the winch, which was a robust motorized drum. He was the one who was accountable for making use of it. During the time that it was being utilized, the wire that was attached to Gordon's harness was supposed to be coiled up over itself. Gordon would be elevated off the lower platform in a gentle and secure manner while simultaneously dangling in the air before the hoist operator would start the winch as soon as he received the signal. This would take place while Gordon was suspended in the air. In order for him to be able to access the cables that were malfunctioning, it would be necessary to hoist him to a height of approximately 10 feet high. When he had finished making the necessary repairs, he would be brought back down to earth and then lowered back down again. In no way is it challenging. This thing happens rather frequently. Without risk, provided that all individuals fulfilled their tasks in a manner that was deemed acceptable. Due to the fact that this was the case, Gordon made his way from the main deck to the small industrial elevator, where he proceeded to descend one level. He walked out of the building after exiting the elevator on the bottom platform and leaving the building. At this particular location, the darkness was more pervasive, and the wind that blasted through the steel skeleton of the rig was more forceful than it had been previously. It wasn't until he looked up that he realized that the faces of his coworkers were looking down at him through the mouse hole that was 10 inches in diameter. He was surprised to see them. A moment had passed before the harness was dangling down through the opening, and it was gently swinging in the breeze. This occurred as soon as the moment had passed. There was not the slightest bit of a departure from the initial concept. Gordon caught it in his grasp and took it with him. As soon as he had finished putting on the leg straps, he brought the harness all the way up to his ankles and then fastened it round his waist to ensure that it was adequately protected. He gave it a couple of forceful pulls with the purpose of ensuring that it was tight and snug. He thought this would be the best way to accomplish this. In spite of the fact that he was a professional, he never made any kind of compromises with regard to the safety of the situation. After reaching a position where he was content, He looked up at the crew and offered a clear indication of satisfaction by giving a thumbs up. He was satisfied with the team's performance. On his own, he was prepared. It was possible for the crewmen who were stationed on the main deck to pick up his signal. One of them turned around and used a hand signal that was very clear and that they had all prepared in order to successfully communicate with the individual who was operating the hoist. He became aware of the signal while he was sitting in his cab, which is when the hoist operator was able to see it. A thumbs up was his response, and he proceeded to turn on the winch after hearing it. A faint hum could be heard as the winch started to turn, and the wire started to reel in as it was being drawn in that direction. The occurrence of both of these events took place concurrently. While Gordon was standing on the platform, he felt his feet progressively lift off of the steel grating that was supported by it. This occurred while he was standing on the base of the platform. The harness and the wire were providing him with complete support for his weight at the time that he was hung in the air. As he continued to climb slowly over the course of a number of moments, the lower deck began to decrease in size underneath him. Eventually, he reached a height of approximately 10 feet. Which was perfectly level with the collection of wires that he wanted to replace. He eventually reached his goal. He was currently situated on the main deck, which was not too far below the crew. It was not too far below them. By looking through the hole in the mouse, he was able to gain a view of them that was unobstructed. It was through the use of a wave that he conveyed to them that he was going into position before they could move into position. He declared loudly, "I'm good," in spite of the wind that was blowing. "I'm fine." The crew communicated the message to the hoist operator, and the hoist operator immediately stopped the winch after getting the message. "I'm fine." The wind was softly moving Gordon from side to side as he moved through the air at this very time. Gordon was suspended in the air at this very moment. He started the delicate work on the cables after removing his tools from the belt he was carrying and commencing to work on them. Additionally, he began working on the cables. He was the one who initiated the work in the first place. While he was working, he had to brace himself against the machinery in order to maintain his equilibrium. This was necessary in order for him to continue working. Throughout the entire ordeal, his crew was maintaining a watchful eye from above, which meant that they were ready to provide assistance in the event that it was required. He was able to perform the repair on his own after a few minutes had elapsed, with no assistance from anybody else. The cables were in no manner in danger of being damaged in any way. It has been determined that the work has been successfully completed. After putting his tools away, he looked up through the mouse hole once more and then signaled to the team something else. He also placed his tools away within the mouse hole. Subsequently, he stowed his tools safely behind him. At long last, he had succeeded in reaching his conclusion. That he was getting ready to be dropped back down to the ground was obvious to anyone who looked at him. For the first time, the crew was made aware of its existence while they were on the main deck. In order to bring the winch down to its lower position, they delivered the hand signal that had been decided upon to the hoist operator once the turn had been completed. When the operator became aware of their presence, he gave a brief nod and then swiftly grabbed for the controls in order to restart the winch. He did this as soon as he realized that they were there. Furthermore, this is the time at which the ordinary everyday procedure began to go horribly and catastrophically wrong. This is the point at which the tragedy occurred. The individual who was operating the hoist made a mistake that was one that was rather simple to identify. It is possible for anyone to make a mistake, but it is a mistake that, given the circumstances that are present in this particular setting, would have ramifications that would be lethal. It was only the switch on the right that he failed to activate, and it was the only one as well. It would be a switch that would allow the winch motor to turn in the opposite way from the direction in which it is turning, which is the current direction. It was not the winch's intention to spool the line out and gently lower Gordon back to the platform. Rather, it started to loop the wire in, which resulted in Gordon being pulled higher. At that same instant, he started working the winch for the first time. The winch moved in a manner that was slower and more sluggish than usual. On the other hand, it was not consistent with the idea that he had been propelled in a vertical trajectory. A pull that was gradual, persistent, and unyielding was applied to the group. This pull kept the group from moving forward. On the other hand, the issue was something that was readily apparent to everyone, with the exception of the one person who was in a position to put an end to it. When Gordon was in this circumstance, he had the sensation that he was rising rather than plummeting through the air. He was experiencing a severe shaking in his chest. He cried out loud, "Whoa, stop, stop!" The crew on the main deck also noticed it and exclaimed, "Wrong way!" Gordon was seen climbing toward the steel floor rather than descending, which was what they had believed he would do. They expected him to fall. At first, they were overcome with a feeling of bewilderment, and then, after that, they experienced a surge of panic. At the very moment that they came across the individual who was operating the hoist, they immediately began shouting and thrashing their arms in a wild manner. "Stop! Stop the winch! Reverse it!" Nevertheless, the commotion that was generated by the rig was so loud that it entirely overwhelmed their objections. This was the case. A lot of sounds can be heard, such as the deafening clatter of metal against metal, the shriek of the wind, and the boom of the generators. These are just some of the sounds that can be heard. It was surrounded by sound, as if it were a wall of sound waves. It was made even more difficult by the fact that the hoist operator had temporarily turned away from them after beginning the winch operation. This made the situation even more difficult. That made the position a great deal more challenging. This, from his point of view, marked the conclusion of a line of work that was considered to be exceedingly mundane. He could have been doing nothing more than stretching his back, making a note in a logbook, or taking a quick check at a gauge. All of these possibilities are possible. During the same period of time, each of these occurrences happened simultaneously. At no point in time did he direct his attention particularly toward the workers. He was completely oblivious to the idea that the imminent catastrophe was only a few yards away, despite the fact that it was coming closer. Due to the fact that the volume of the disturbance was so much higher than his hearing, he was unable to hear their frantic cries. As a consequence of this, the winch maintained its hard and unrelenting rotation in this manner. To be more specific, it seemed as though Gordon was being drawn closer and closer to the underside of the main deck, and more specifically, in the direction of that microscopic mouse hole that measured 10 inches in diameter. A feeling of anxiety began to creep into my body. It was something that Gordon was fully aware of, and he was conscious of the fact that he was unable to free himself from the harness on his own. However, it is not the case at all while it is suspended in the air. The only thing that could save him would be if the operator was able to stop the machine, which would be the only outcome that would be possible. At this very time, he was not only becoming irritated, but he was also becoming terrified of what was going to take place. During this time, he was screeching, a sound that was both frantic and primitive, like the sound of a man who is aware that his fate is drawing near, but is unable to stop it from happening. He was shouting. At the same time, the crew that was working on the main deck was experiencing a full-blown panic attack. This was happening simultaneously. Even though they were yelling at the top of their lungs and throwing their arms around like crazy people, nothing was working to get their point across. They were unable to get their point across. One of the crew members came to the idea that they needed to take a different strategy after they realized that their yells and signals were not effective. This discovery led to the realization that they needed to adopt a different approach. In order to attract the attention of the operator, he was going to have to devise a new plan with which to approach the situation. Instantaneously, he moved away from the group that was gathered around the mouse hole and began running across the deck in the direction of a nearby emergency telephone. He immediately removed himself from the gathering. The station that was in charge of operating the hoist made use of this telephone as a direct line of communication with the station. In an instant, the phone that was in the operator's cab started to ring, and he swiftly lifted the receiver from the cradle that it was lying on. He then proceeded to answer the call. When the hoist operator got back into the cab, he continued to be unaware of the situation that was taking place. He was taken aback by the abrupt and constant ringing of the phone, which caught him off guard and caused him to be taken aback. As soon as he had picked it up and placed it to his ear, he was immediately overwhelmed with frantic and frightened cries, all of which were directed toward him in an attempt to prevent the winch from being forced on him. As if a flood of uncertainty crashed over him totally, he was completely astonished. He quickly turned his head around, peered in the direction of the controls for the winch, and then slammed his hand down on the large red button that was designated for emergency stops. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. This action was carried out without him giving it even a second's consideration. It was the winch motor, which had been generating a groaning sound, that brought about the quick and abrupt halt that was brought about. At that point, however, it was already too late. Before Gordon arrived at the underside of the deck, his crewmate was frantically trying to get to the phone. Gordon had arrived just a few moments earlier. Just a few moments ago, Gordon had arrived at the location. While he was being pulled against the cold, hard steel, he twisted his body in an attempt to position himself in a vertical position. He made this effort while he was being pulled against the steel. During the time that he was contemplating it, he was thinking about the chance that he might be able to fit his upper body through the hole that was 10 inches in diameter. In spite of the fact that he was well aware that it would be incredibly painful and that it would result in bones breaking, he was willing to put his life in jeopardy for it. The amount of damage that they cause would be reduced as a result. It was not able to execute this task due to the design of the safety harness, which prevented it from being accomplished. Due to the fact that the primary straps were wrapped around his waist, he was able to maintain his seated position for the entirety of the operation. To obtain the desired outcome of straightening up into a vertical line, it was not possible to reach the desired result. Horizontal was one of the few positions that he was able to keep up for an extended period of time. He was aware of what was about to take place at the time that was about to occur, despite the fact that he was pressed up against the steel and looked up at the small circle of darkness that was above him. In a desperate attempt to ensure his own existence, he extended out his arms and legs and forced them on the underside of the deck. This was his last-ditch effort. It was a conscious effort on his part to physically fight the pull of the winch in order to achieve his goal of pulling himself away from the pit. The results of his efforts, on the other hand, were not successful. However, he was going up against a machine that possessed a power that was significantly higher than his own. He was going up against it. It was impossible for him to take any kind of action in light of this situation. Despite the fact that the winch continued to revolve, this fact remained. For the first time, his pelvis was inserted into the hole, which measured 10 inches in diameter. This was the first part of his body to be implanted. This particular part of his body was the first one to be removed from his body. The tremendous amount of pressure that was being applied to his body caused it to start disintegrating, which was a direct consequence of the situation. It was impossible to comprehend the level of anguish that he was experiencing as he let out a scream. Gordon had already left the building by the time the hoist operator finally clicked the button that indicates the stop of the hoist. However, by that time, the hoist had already stopped. There was only a small section of his torso that had been able to pass through the opening. This was the only part of his body that had been preserved. An investigation was initiated in the wake of the tragic event in order to look into the problems that were associated with the circumstance. The investigation led to the discovery that the company that Gordon owned had been flagrantly irresponsible with regard to a variety of fundamental safety procedures. This was uncovered as a result of the investigation. Unfortunately, it was found out that the hoist operator had not been given adequate training on the particular winch mechanism that he was using. This was a very unfortunate discovery. The fact that the operator and the person who was wearing the harness did not have a direct line of sight with one another constitutes a blatant violation of the statutory safeguarding procedures that are in place. The individual was dressed in the harness that they were wearing. Through the course of the investigation, it was discovered that the communication system, which relied on hand signals in an environment that was both noisy and chaotic, was significantly deficient. This was discovered during the course of the investigation. To add insult to injury, there ought to have been a specialized signaler whose sole responsibility was to communicate with the hoist operator. This constitutes the bare minimum that ought to have been present. In addition, there is the potential that the two audio lines need to have been physically connected to one another. There was no room for even a single obvious fault that could have been produced by humans because the entire system was devoid of redundancy. This meant that there was no room for any errors to occur. After it was determined that Gordon's company was to fault for these failings, they were issued a punishment of £60,000 as a consequence of this decision. Over the course of the period in which Gordon's family was in a state of grief, they were also presented with an amount of money that was kept secret. However, there is no amount of money that could bring back a husband and a father, a man who went to work one night to perform a normal job and never returned home, all because of a switch that was forgotten. Because of this, there is no amount of money that could bring back this man. The occurrence of this incident was brought about by a switch that was never called to mind. When it comes to oil rigs, which are among the most hazardous places of employment in the entire world, there is no such thing as a normal work schedule. The risks associated with these jobs are extremely high. The tragic truth of this circumstance was brought to our attention by the fact that he had passed away. To begin, I would like to convey my appreciation for your presence in this room today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would be grateful if you could share your thoughts with me in the comments section. Thank you in advance for your involvement. It is also important to keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime available for you to view all at once right now. Within a single sitting, you are able to watch all of these episodes, at least till the next time we get together. How are things going? In 1957, in the quiet, hard-working town of Akron, Ohio, a 31-year-old man named Larry Bader was trying his best to build a good life. He had a wife, Mary Lou, and 3 young kids who were his entire world. By all accounts, Larry was a wonderful father and a loving husband. He was the kind of guy who would do anything for his family. But there was one area where Larry consistently struggled, and that was business. He had the heart of an entrepreneur, always brimming with new ideas and big dreams. Over the years, he had poured his energy and what little money they had into one venture after another. But each one, for one reason or another, had failed to take off. These failures left the Bader family in a deep hole of debt. And so, Larry had to put his entrepreneurial dreams on the shelf. He couldn't afford to take any more risks. He needed a steady paycheck to keep a roof over his family's head and food on the table. He took a job as a cookware salesman for a local company. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't his passion, but it paid the bills. The work was a daily reminder of his failed ambitions, and it wore on him. To escape the pressure and the quiet disappointment of his life, Larry had found a sanctuary. That sanctuary was Lake Erie, about an hour's drive north of their home. On the weekends, if Mary Lou was okay with managing the kids on her own, Larry would pack up his gear and his small boat and just disappear. Out on the water with a fishing line in his hand, he could disconnect from the bills, from the sales quotas, and from the life he felt he was supposed to be living. It was his way of resetting, of finding a small piece of peace. On Friday, the 15th of March, 1957, Larry came to his wife with his usual weekend request. He told her he really needed to get away, to head up to the lake and do some fishing. Mary Lou, as always, was supportive. She knew how much he needed these trips. But this time, she was worried. She told him she had heard the weather forecast, and it wasn't good. A big storm was supposed to roll in over the lake. She asked him if he was sure it was a good idea to go. Larry just smiled and waved it off. He told her not to worry, that the news always exaggerated these things. He said the storms were never as bad as they predicted, and he would be perfectly fine. And so, with that reassurance, he kissed Mary Lou goodbye, he kissed each of his 3 children, grabbed his fishing gear, and headed out the door. He hopped in his truck and drove north towards the calm, gray waters of Lake Erie. That night, the storm that Mary Lou had worried about crashed down on Lake Erie with a vengeance. It was far worse than anyone had predicted. The winds howled, and the rain came down in sheets, turning the lake's surface into a violent, churning mess. The following morning, as the storm began to subside, the Coast Guard was out on patrol, surveying the damage. And that's when they found it. A small boat, bobbing aimlessly in the waves. It was Larry Bader's boat. They pulled up alongside it and saw that it had some minor damage, like it had been battered around by the storm. One of the oars was missing, and so was Larry. A massive search was launched immediately. The Coast Guard scoured the lake and the shoreline for days, hoping to find any sign of him. But there was nothing. Larry Bader had simply vanished into the storm. After weeks of searching turned up no body and no new clues, the authorities had to make a difficult call. Larry Bader was officially declared dead, lost to the unforgiving waters of Lake Erie. His family, though they had no body to bury, held a funeral to say their goodbyes. Mary Lou was devastated, but she had to be strong for her children. She cashed in Larry's life insurance policy. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough to pay off their debts and give her and the kids a chance to start over, to build a new life without their father and husband. Fast forward 8 long years to 1965. Life had moved on for the Bader family. Larry's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Pekka, was in Chicago for a sporting goods show. She was with a friend, and they were wandering through the massive convention hall, looking at all the latest fishing rods, camping gear, and hunting equipment. As they walked, they noticed a large crowd gathered around one of the exhibits off to the side. Curious, they decided to see what all the excitement was about. They worked their way through the group of people until they could see what was happening in the center. There, a man was putting on an archery demonstration. He had a big, thick mustache and was wearing a black eye patch over one eye. He stood with a confident posture, holding a bow, and was methodically shooting arrows at a target about 30 feet away. Suzanne and her friend watched for a few minutes, and it quickly became clear why this man had drawn such a crowd. He was an incredible archer. Arrow after arrow flew from his bow and landed squarely in the bullseye. He almost never missed. It was a mesmerizing display of skill. As they stood there watching, Suzanne's friend started looking more closely at the archer, not just at his skill, but at his face. After a moment, he turned to Suzanne with a strange look. He said to her, "Hey, doesn't that guy look exactly like your uncle? The one who disappeared on Lake Erie?" Suzanne was taken aback. Her Uncle Larry had been gone for 8 years, and it was strange to hear him mentioned so suddenly. But she turned her gaze back to the man with the eye patch, and this time she looked at him differently. And then she saw it. The resemblance was uncanny. Even with the mustache and the eye patch, the shape of his face, his build, the way he carried himself, it was a spitting image of her Uncle Larry. And then another piece clicked into place in her mind. Her Uncle Larry had also been known for being a phenomenal archer. It was one of his favorite hobbies. Here was a man who looked just like him and had the exact same rare talent. The coincidence felt too big to ignore. As soon as the demonstration ended and the crowd started to thin out, Suzanne and her friend rushed over to the man. Suzanne's heart was pounding. She walked right up to him and said, "I know this is going to sound crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader. He went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago." The man looked at her, and a polite, slightly confused smile crossed his face. He told her he was sorry, but he didn't know anyone named Larry Bader. He said his name was John Johnson, but everyone called him Fritz. He repeated that he was sorry, but he couldn't help her. But Suzanne wasn't convinced. The more she looked at him, the more certain she became. The denial didn't shake her. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, you are Larry Bader. I am positive you're my uncle." At this point, Fritz's politeness started to wear a little thin. He was firm, but not rude. He reiterated that he was not her uncle. He told her he didn't know who Larry Bader was, that he'd never been to Lake Erie. He tried to explain his life to her, to show her how impossible it was. He said he lived in Omaha, Nebraska with his wife and his kids. He told her he was a sports journalist on television in Omaha and also worked as a consultant for archery companies, which is why he was at the show. He looked at her, completely bewildered, and said he just didn't understand why she thought he was her uncle, but he wasn't. And with that, Fritz turned and walked away, leaving Suzanne and her friends standing there in shock. But they were not deterred. Not in the slightest. They were now more convinced than ever that this man was Larry Bader, and he was either lying or something very strange was going on. They ran to find a payphone. Suzanne called her two other uncles, Larry's brothers. She frantically explained what had just happened, how she had found a man who was the spitting image of their long-lost brother. Her uncles were skeptical at first, but the conviction in Suzanne's voice was enough. They told her to stay put. They booked the next flight to Chicago and flew out that very night. The next morning, Suzanne and her friend met her two uncles at the sporting goods show. They all went straight to the archery exhibit. And sure enough, there he was. Fritz Johnson, with his eye patch and mustache, doing another one of his incredible archery demonstrations. They waited patiently until there was a break. Then the four of them, Suzanne, her friend, and Larry Bader's two brothers, walked over to him. As soon as the brothers saw Fritz up close, any doubt they might have had vanished. Despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, despite the 8 years that had passed, they knew this was their brother. They approached him calmly. One of the brothers spoke, telling him that they knew he was saying he wasn't Larry, but the resemblance was just too strong to be a coincidence. He explained that they had been searching for their brother for a very long time. Then he pulled out some papers. He told Fritz that they had Larry's old military records, which included a full set of his fingerprints. He asked Fritz, "Please, just humor us. Come with us to the police station and get your fingerprints taken. It's the only way to prove to us that you aren't our brother." It would be a huge favor and would finally give them some closure. Fritz was clearly annoyed. He didn't want to do it. This whole thing was a ridiculous distraction. But he looked at the hopeful, desperate faces of these strangers and sighed. He figured it was the quickest way to end this bizarre situation. He said, "Fine. I'll go to the police station. I'll get my fingerprints taken, and then we can all put this behind us." And so, later that day, they all left the sporting goods show and went to a local Chicago police station. Fritz Johnson sat patiently while an officer rolled his fingertips in ink and pressed them onto a card. The officer then took the new prints and compared them with the ones from Larry Bader's military file. After a few minutes of careful examination, the officer looked up at Fritz, and he told him, "You are Larry Bader." When Fritz heard those words, he was in a state of pure disbelief. It wasn't a moment of revelation for him. No flood of lost memories came rushing back. In fact, it was the exact opposite. His mind was a blank slate when it came to Larry Bader. He immediately started trying to make sense of it, racking his brain, searching for any inconsistency in his own memory, any clue that his life as Fritz Johnson wasn't real, but he found nothing. All he could remember was a continuous, unbroken life. He had memories of being a young child named Fritz Johnson, growing up and living his life all the way up to that present moment in the police station. But now he was being told that the vast majority of those memories were a complete fabrication. He was never a child named Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader, a man from Ohio, and he had only become Fritz Johnson 8 years ago. The timeline of what actually happened is still murky, but investigators were able to piece together a rough sketch. It seems that just a few days, or maybe a few months, after Larry Bader disappeared on Lake Erie, a man calling himself Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska. He walked into a local restaurant and asked for a job. He provided documents that seemed to prove his identity, and nobody had any reason to question him. He seemed like a completely normal, friendly guy. There was nothing about his behavior that raised any red flags. Over the next 8 years, Fritz wove himself into the very fabric of the Omaha community. He got married to a woman there. He had a child with her and adopted another. He was a good husband and a good father. He eventually left his job as a bartender and, through his charisma and talent, landed an amazing job as a sports broadcaster for the local television station. In Omaha, Fritz Johnson was a minor celebrity. People recognized him on the street. They'd wave and say, "Hey, Fritz, how are you doing?" He had built a full, successful, and happy life from scratch. But as soon as the news broke that he was actually Larry Bader, that carefully constructed life came crashing down around him. The television station he worked for fired him immediately. His second wife, the woman in Omaha, left him. It turned out their marriage had never been legally valid in the first place because Larry Bader was still legally married to his first wife, Mary Lou, and to make matters worse, the insurance company that had paid out the life insurance policy to Mary Lou all those years ago now demanded that the money be repaid in full. Throughout this entire chaotic ordeal, as his world fell apart, Fritz continued to insist that he was not Larry Bader. He was convinced it was all a huge, unexplainable mistake. He simply could not comprehend how any of this could have happened. It made no sense to him. Eventually, a team of experts, including doctors and psychologists, was brought in to examine him. They put him through nearly 2 weeks of intensive tests and evaluations. At the end of it all, they came to 2 firm conclusions. First, there was no doubt whatsoever that he was, in fact, Larry Bader. The physical evidence was undeniable. And second, he was almost certainly suffering from an extreme and profound case of amnesia, a total loss of his previous identity and memories. But how he had developed this amnesia, the doctors had no idea. And of course, Fritz had no idea either. It's unlikely we will ever get any more answers about what truly happened to Larry Bader on that stormy day on Lake Erie. Because just 1 year after his old identity was discovered, Fritz Johnson, or Larry Bader, passed away. He had been suffering from cancer in one of his eyes, which was why he wore the eye patch. The cancer returned, and this time it took his life. He died without ever recovering a single memory of his life as Larry Bader. Today, his case is still considered one of the most baffling and believable cases of profound amnesia ever recorded. He was a man who lived 2 completely separate lives, and he died only remembering one of them. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia, there's a thick green jungle that stretches for miles. If you know where to look, you can find a narrow walking path that winds its way from the edge of the town deep into the wilderness. If you follow that path far enough, it will eventually lead you to a truly incredible sight, an enormous old railroad bridge that spans a huge deep ravine. The bridge is no longer used for trains. It was decommissioned many years ago. But, ironically, since the trains stopped running, the bridge has seen more traffic than ever. It's just a different kind of traffic now. People come from all over to visit this bridge for one specific, heart-pounding reason: to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people leap from high places, like this very bridge, with a long, elastic rope tied to their ankles. The length of that rope is carefully calculated so that when it stretches to its absolute limit, the jumper will stop just short of hitting the ground below. It's an adrenaline rush unlike any other. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez was living in the city of Medellin, about an hour north of Amaga. She turned to her boyfriend and told him she was finally ready to do it. She wanted to go bungee jumping. This was a conversation they had had many times before. Yesenia had always been fascinated by the idea of it, but every time they made actual plans to go, her fear would get the better of her and she would back out at the last minute. But this time was different. For whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia felt she had the courage to finally see it through. Her boyfriend, hearing the seriousness in her voice, seized the opportunity. He had never been bungee jumping either and was eager to try it, but he wouldn't go without her. Now that she seemed genuinely committed, he immediately got on the phone and called the Amaga Bungee Jumping Company. He booked a spot for both of them to jump from the famous railroad bridge. On the day of their jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend got in their car and made the hour-long drive south to Amaga. They found the walking trail and began the trek through the jungle out to the bridge. When they finally emerged from the trees and stepped onto the structure, they were stunned. They knew it was a popular spot, but they had not expected to see so many people. A long line of jumpers, nearly 100 of them, was already snaking its way across the bridge, all waiting for their turn to take the leap. Yesenia and her boyfriend found the end of the line and began their wait. Over the next several hours, they had a front row seat to the spectacle. One by one, they watched the people ahead of them get harnessed up, walk to the edge, and plummet into the ravine below, their screams of terror quickly turning into shouts of joy. In her mind, Yesenia had pictured arriving at the bridge, quickly getting it over with, and then celebrating their bravery. But this long, drawn-out wait was having the opposite effect. With every person who jumped, her own anxiety grew. Suddenly, bungee jumping didn't look fun at all. It looked terrifying. She started to second-guess her decision all over again. Her boyfriend could see the panic rising in her eyes. He tried to calm her down, pointing out how safe it was. He told her to look at all the people who had already jumped. They were all perfectly fine, all smiling and laughing. He told her how proud she would be of herself once it was over. But despite his best efforts, Yesenia couldn't shake the fear. Still, she told him she wasn't going to back down. She was determined to go through with it. Several more high-stress hours passed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line. A staff member who had been running the jumps all day long signaled for them to step forward onto the launch platform. They walked to the very edge, looking down into the vast, empty space of the ravine. The staff began fitting them with their harnesses and safety gear. The whole time, Yesenia's panic was escalating. Her heart was hammering in her chest. Her vision started to narrow. This didn't feel like an adventure anymore. It just felt like something she had to survive. She just wanted it to be over. As the staff members were making their final checks, one of them looked at her boyfriend, whose gear was fully connected, and gave the signal. He said, "Okay, jump." Yesenia heard the command. In her panicked state, in the blur of fear and adrenaline, she thought he was talking to her. And so, without a moment's hesitation, Yesenia jumped. But she had made a terrible mistake. The staff member had been talking to her boyfriend, not to her. The staff had only finished putting her harness on. They had not yet attached the actual elastic bungee rope to her ankles. When Yesenia leaped from the platform, there was nothing to stop her fall. Her boyfriend watched in horror. He ripped off his own gear and sprinted down the bridge, leaping over the railing and scrambling down the steep, rocky hillside into the ravine. But by the time he reached his girlfriend at the bottom, it was too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined that Yesenia did not die from the impact with the ground. The autopsy revealed that she had actually died from a massive heart attack that she suffered during the fall. This means she must have realized in those few terrifying seconds after she jumped that she had made a mistake. She knew the bungee cord wasn't attached. And the sheer overwhelming fear of what was about to happen is what literally killed her before she ever reached the bottom. In early 1974, in the small town of Ossett in central England, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living a happy life. He had a wife named Christine and 5 children, and he was known throughout their neighborhood as a great father and a wonderful husband with a fantastic sense of humor. Neighbors would often say that when you walked past the Taylor house, you could almost always hear the sound of Michael laughing or telling jokes to his family. Their home was a place filled with joy. But in April of that year, everything changed. Michael was doing some repairs around the house when he fell from a ladder and injured his back. The injury itself wasn't severe, but it left him with chronic, nagging pain. And that constant pain began to change him. The cheerful, funny, happy-go-lucky Michael Taylor slowly disappeared. In his place was a man who was sad, withdrawn, and deeply depressed. He became so irritable that his own family found it difficult to be around him. He would lash out at them over the smallest things. The laughter in the Taylor home was replaced with a tense silence. The Taylors were not a particularly religious family, but in a small town like Osset at that time, most of their friends and neighbors were. When one of Michael's friends learned about how much he was struggling, he approached Michael with a suggestion. He told him that he should really consider turning to religion for help and guidance. Specifically, he recommended a local Christian group called the Christian Fellowship Group. It wasn't a formal church, but rather a small, dedicated prayer group for people who wanted a deeper level of spiritual support. But the real draw of this group, the friend explained, was its leader. Her name was Marie Robinson. She was only 21 years old, but she was incredibly charismatic, energetic, and friendly. She had a special way of making everyone in her group feel welcome and important. Michael's friend was convinced that Marie could be the one to help him, that she could help him find his way back to being his old self. Michael was at rock bottom. He was desperate and felt like he had nothing to lose. So he agreed to give it a try. On the 12th of September, 1974, Michael went to the church where the fellowship group held its meetings. He walked inside and found his way to a back room. When he entered, he saw about 20 people sitting in a circle of chairs. As soon as they noticed him, they all stood up and greeted him with open arms, welcoming him and inviting him to sit with them. Then, the woman who had to be Marie stood up. She had a huge, warm smile on her face. She looked directly at Michael and encouraged him to come and take the empty seat right next to her. For the first time in a very long time, a genuine smile spread across Michael's face. He walked across the room and sat down beside Marie. As she began to lead the group in prayer, Michael noticed something incredible. For that brief period of time, he didn't feel his chronic back pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael returned home, the pain and the depression came flooding back. It was as if the only place he could find relief was inside that church with that group. And so, Michael became completely devoted to it. He attended every single meeting. Over the next couple of weeks, he grew very close to Marie, and it seemed that Marie was growing very close to him as well. They started staying behind after the meetings were over, just the two of them, spending time together in what they called quiet prayer. Nobody knew exactly what they were doing, but their bond was obvious. It wasn't long before other members of the group began to suspect that they were having an affair. In a small town like Osset, rumors travel fast. The whispers from inside the church soon spread throughout the town. And before long, Michael's wife, Christine, started hearing them from her friends and neighbors. She was told that her husband was cheating on her with the young leader of his new prayer group. Christine had already had her own suspicion. Marie was the only thing Michael ever talked about anymore. On October 1st, just a few weeks after Michael first joined the group, Christine decided she had to know the truth. She waited until Michael left the house to head to his evening meeting. Then she got in her car and followed him to the church. She parked across the street, took a deep breath to steady her nerves, and then she got out and marched towards the front doors. She stormed inside, found the room where the meeting was being held, and burst through the door. She pointed directly at her husband, who was sitting with his back to her, and she yelled, "I know you're having an affair with Marie." You're going to admit it, right here, in front of this whole group. Michael stood up from his chair. But instead of turning to face his wife, instead of addressing her accusation, he turned and stared across the room at Marie. And when Marie made eye contact with him, she let out a blood-curdling scream. She would later say that in that moment, Michael didn't look human. He looked, in her words, like a beast. His eyes were wild. As Michael stood there, locked in this intense, aggressive stare with Marie, he suddenly began speaking in tongues. It's a phenomenon where a person utters words or sounds that resemble a language, but it's unintelligible to the speaker. The belief is that some other entity is speaking through them. Michael was barking these strange words and sounds at Marie. Everyone else in the room was frozen in shock. It had all happened so fast. Christine's sudden accusation, Michael's bizarre and terrifying reaction. Before anyone could do anything, Michael went from just speaking in tongues to lunging across the room as if he was going to physically attack Marie. Instantly, the other members of the group sprang into action. They jumped on top of Michael, trying to hold him down. But even with 10 or 15 people piling on top of him, he fought with an incredible strength, screaming and snarling, still trying to get to Marie. And then, something even stranger happened. Marie herself suddenly broke out into tongues. And as soon as she did, Michael stopped struggling so violently. He stayed on the floor, pinned down, and just continued to speak in tongues back at her. The two of them were looking at each other, having this strange, otherworldly conversation, while the rest of the group, completely dumbfounded, could only pray. After about an hour of this, Michael suddenly went limp. He collapsed as if he had lost consciousness. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at Michael's still form on the floor. After a moment, his eyes fluttered open. He looked around frantically as if he was waking up in a strange place with no idea how he had gotten there. Michael would claim he had absolutely no memory of the events that had just transpired. At this point, Marie turned to him and Christine. She told them that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force. And the only way to help him, she said, was to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is a religious ritual aimed at expelling a supposedly evil spirit from a person or a place. Michael and Christine were completely at a loss. They were both in a state of shock for very different reasons, and they had no idea what to do. They simply deferred to Marie's judgment. They agreed that an exorcism seemed like the only way forward. So they left the church and went home. The next morning, Marie contacted the Anglican Church of England and formally requested an exorcism for Michael Taylor. After hearing the details of what had happened, the church agreed. They said it did indeed sound like a case that required an exorcism. The following day, they sent two of their most experienced exorcists, a man named Peter and another named Raymond, to Ossett. Peter and Raymond went to the Taylor home and observed Michael. It didn't take them long to reach the same conclusion. They too believed that Michael was possessed by at least one demonic entity. They told Michael that an exorcism was the only solution, but they needed his full consent to proceed. Michael agreed. Christine, still completely overwhelmed and just going along with whatever the experts said, agreed as well. A day later, on the night of October 4th, everyone gathered at another church in a neighboring town. It was 10 p.m. Michael, Christine, the two exorcists, and all the members of the Christian fellowship group were there. Michael was seated in a chair in the middle of the room. As soon as Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying, Michael erupted. He started screaming in tongues and writhing in his chair. He fell to the floor and began contorting his body into grotesque and unnatural positions, as if the words of the prayers were causing him physical agony. The exorcism went on for 8 straight hours. At one point, they had to physically tie Michael down to prevent him from harming himself or anyone else in the room. Finally, after 8 grueling hours, they stopped. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. Michael looked completely drained. As soon as the ritual paused, he collapsed on the ground unconscious. When he eventually came to, he was still tied down, and he looked around wildly, again with no memory of what had just happened. Peter and Raymond told him that the exorcism had been mostly successful. They claimed they had identified 40 different demons inside of him and that the ritual had managed to expel 37 of them. But, they warned, there were still 3 demons left inside. They were all too tired to continue right now. They told Michael to go home, get some rest, and they would return the next day to finish the job and cast out the final 3 demons. And so, Michael and Christine left the church and headed home. A few hours later, around noon the next day, a woman who lived near the Taylors heard a strange noise outside her house. It sounded like someone yelling. She went to her front window and pulled back the curtain to look outside. What she saw made her gasp. Walking down the middle of the street was Michael Taylor. He was completely naked and covered from head to toe in blood. He was rambling incoherently about Satan. The woman immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, they found Michael curled up in the fetal position on the sidewalk outside the woman's house. He was giggling to himself like a small child. The police cautiously approached him. At some point, Michael seemed to snap out of his state and looked up at the officers as if he had no idea what was going on. They eventually got him to tell them his name and where he lived. After calling for backup to handle Michael, the first responding officers made their way to the Taylor residence. They went inside. And the moment they saw the scene, one of the officers turned around, ran back outside, and began to vomit on the lawn. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous and gruesome crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and Christine had returned from the exorcism, Michael had fallen into another one of his trances. He had brutally attacked his wife, beating her until she fell to the ground. Then, as she was dying, Michael had jumped on top of her and, using only his bare hands, had ripped her face off and thrown it across the room. As she bled to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his own body. After she was dead, he found the family dog and killed it as well. Fortunately, their 5 children had not been home at the time of the horrific attack, and they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, both the prosecution and the defense pointed the finger at the Anglican Church and at Marie Robinson's religious group. They argued that by performing the exorcism, they had effectively convinced Michael that he was possessed by demons, which in turn caused him to have a psychotic break and act out with such extreme violence. Ultimately, Michael Taylor was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He spent only 4 years in psychiatric care before he was released. Today, he is reportedly still living as a free man in Ossett. But despite the legal outcome, there are many people, both religious and non-religious, who believe the case of Michael Taylor is one of the few genuine and terrifying cases of demonic possession in modern history. And as for whether Michael and Marie were actually having an affair, it was never definitively proven, but it has always been widely assumed that they were. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. When you think of Russia, your thoughts most likely go to the major cities that are located on the western edge of the country, which is the region of the country that is geographically located in Europe. You may visualize the onion domes that are so famous in Moscow or the streets of St. Petersburg, which are so historically significant. That is correct, by the way. The majority of the population are located there, and the majority of the historical events that we read about took place there. On the other hand, the portion of Russia known as European Russia accounts for only roughly 23% of the overall area of the country. A vast, untamed, and frequently cruel swath of territory that extends all the way to the Pacific Ocean makes up the remaining 77% of the land of the United States. A region known as Siberia is located here. An understatement would be to suggest that Siberia is a landmass. The vastness of this globe, which is comprised of lush woods, towering mountain ranges, and icy tundra, is approximately 50 times larger than the entirety of the United Kingdom. Extremism is the word that best defines what is going on here. One of the most difficult obstacles to overcome is the weather. Over the course of a whole year, the average temperature across the entirety of Siberia is consistently rather close to freezing. Because it can reach temperatures that are unfathomable throughout the winter, it is considered to be one of the coldest spots on the globe where people live. Moreover, the weather is not the only thing that is attempting to take your life. Just as daunting is the wildlife that can be found in Siberia. The grizzly bears that are found in North America are of the same species as the enormous brown bears that you have. Gray wolves can be found in packs, and some of them can grow to reach almost 200 pounds in weight, making them dwarf any other wolves you could encounter in other places. And then there is the Siberian tiger, which is a predator that is both extremely intelligent and extremely powerful. One of the few creatures on Earth that has been documented to intentionally hunt humans, sometimes even for vengeance, these tigers are among the few that have been known to do so. There is a well-known tale that dates back to 1997 about a hunter who accidentally shot and injured a Siberian tiger. This tiger did not pass away. As an alternative, it followed the hunter all the way back to his cabin, waited for him to emerge from the building, and then proceeded to murder and consume him. As you might have guessed, the number of people who choose to reside in Siberia is relatively low. Given the enormous extent of the area, the population is extremely small. On the other hand, for a particular category of individuals, the very same traits that scare away the majority of people are the precise things that attract them. Siberia is one of the few truly wild areas on Earth, and it is a final frontier that needs to be experienced by those who are interested in taking on new challenges and traveling. Additionally, a young man from the United States by the name of Colin Madsen was one of these daring individuals. Growing up in Missouri, Colin was a member of a family that was both prosperous and caring. Since he was a little boy, he had a deep fascination with the natural world. He enjoyed going on hikes, camping, and simply being outside in the greenery. When he was younger, he began reading about Siberia at some time in his life. After looking at photographs of its wild and unspoiled beauty, he became utterly enthralled by the place. What he was interested in was not merely a passing curiosity. In the depths of it, he dove. He started learning about the history of Russia and Siberia, and he even taught himself how to speak Russian well. It wasn't enough for him to simply travel to Siberia. He wanted to live there and completely submerge himself in the culture. Furthermore, in the year 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he was able to turn his desire into success. Irkutsk, which is located in the middle of the world, became his new home after he packed his belongings, said his goodbyes to his family in Missouri, and went there. Irkutsk is one of the few large population concentrations in the southeast region of Siberia, and it is situated directly on the shore of Lake Baikal. The natural wonder that is Lake Baikal is, in and of itself, it is the freshwater lake that is both the oldest and the deepest in the world. It is so deep and clear that in certain areas you can see more than 100 feet below the surface. The idea that Colin had for his new life in Siberia was straightforward but nonetheless grandiose. In order to further his education, he would enroll in a university, and in his leisure time, he would spend it exploring the wilderness that he had fantasized about for such a long time. Moreover, over a period of time, everything proceeded precisely in accordance with that plan. As soon as he was accepted into the local branch of Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, he was able to immediately form a group of friends who shared his enthusiasm for the great outdoors. It was a group of individuals who, just like him, were anxious to explore the immense wilderness that was Siberia. The life that Colin had always desired was the life that he had from the time he came in 2013 until the year 2016. Not only did he excel in his academic pursuits, but he also enthusiastically spent endless weekends and holidays going on hikes and camping in the mountains and forests that encircled Lake Baikal. In addition, he was not only a tourist who went hiking for fun. After gaining such a deep understanding of the area and becoming proficient in negotiating its difficult terrain, he decided to begin working for a local group that was dedicated to charitable causes. Their objective was to establish and label new hiking paths so that others might enjoy them in a secure environment. As a result, Colin was essentially venturing into undiscovered area, so paving the way for new routes through the Siberian wilderness. In a setting where there was very little room for error, he was a knowledgeable individual who was regarded for his abilities and his composed approach to surviving in the environment. Because of this, when his family received the news in 2016 about what had occurred to him, it was something that they simply were unable to comprehend. In the month of March, in the year 2016, Colin and 3 of his closest hiking companions came to the conclusion that it was time for new adventures. As well as being an American, one of the pals was also Russian, and the other 2 were American. In the same way as Colin was, all of them were seasoned outdoor enthusiasts. Following the examination of maps, they settled on a destination, which turned out to be the peak of a mountain that was referred to as Love Peak. They were a few hours' drive away from their home base in Irkutsk, which was located in a little settlement named Arshan. Love Peak was located there. Now, when compared to other hikes in Siberia, this one was not particularly challenging at all. There were some steep sections on the trail that led up to the peak, but it was fairly well defined and had been walked quite a bit. Every single one of the 4 men, including Colin, had hiked it on multiple occasions in the past. It was a trip that was both familiar and reasonably risk-free. Being seasoned hikers in Siberia, however, meant that they were aware of one thing above all others: you should never show disrespect to the natural environment. Without proper preparation, even the most straightforward hike could turn out to be fatal. Anywhere could be a potential danger. As a result, they were very serious about their preparations. In order to rent a tiny rustic cabin at the foot of the mountain, the intention was to drive to Arshan and make the trip there. Using this cottage as their base camp would be their plan. Before beginning their ascent early the following morning, it would provide them with a location to get themselves organized, check their equipment, and get a full night's sleep the night before. Therefore, they made a reservation in advance for one of the cute tiny cabins that were tucked away in the woods and were located close to the trailhead. A few days later, on the morning of March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends began the journey to the village of Arshan by embarking on a westbound journey from Irkutsk. They packed their car with all of their equipment and supplies and began their journey. Upon their arrival, they made a brief detour at a nearby store to purchase some water and food for the last minute, and then they proceeded to make their way to the cabin that they had leased. Exactly as they had anticipated, it was a straightforward location. It was essentially a single room with a few beds, which was just enough to provide refuge from the chilly environmental conditions of Siberia. Inside, there was no plumbing available. In the event that you required the use of the restroom, there was a modest outhouse located a short distance away from the cabin. The 4 companions made themselves comfortable, claimed their mattresses, and immediately began arranging their belongings in preparation for the hike that would take place the next day. They continued to converse, eat, and simply take pleasure in each other's presence as they sat around. The atmosphere was upbeat and full of excitement for the ascent that was still to come. They came to a conclusion regarding their strategy, which stated that they would get up at 5 in the morning to complete their last preparations, with the intention of getting on the route and climbing to the summit of Love Peak no later than 7 o'clock. They were well aware that in order to make that happen, they needed to get some rest. Therefore, at 2 in the morning, they ensured that the lights in the cabin were turned out, and then all 4 of their companions went to bed. It was precisely 5 o'clock in the morning when the alarms went off, which was 3 hours later. At that moment, one of the companions reached over and turned on the light in the cabin. And, at that particular moment, it was manifestly obvious that something was extremely, extremely wrong. He was not in his bed at the time. It was not until later that there was a feeling of panic. After looking over at his vacant bed, the other 3 buddies noticed that all of his personal possessions were still at the location where they had been left. All of his belongings, including his bag, his hiking gear, his wallet, and his phone, were arranged in an orderly fashion exactly where he had left them the previous evening. It was the first and most reasonable assumption that he must have gotten up a little bit earlier than usual and sneaked out of the cabin in a stealthy manner. It is possible that he needed to use the outhouse, or it is also possible that he simply desired to go outdoors and take a breath of fresh air. It was their assumption that he had simply been quiet in order to avoid waking them up and that he would return at any moment. As a result, the three buddies began to get ready for the day, disregarding Colin's absence from these preparations. They anticipated that he would return at any moment and go back through the door. Despite the fact that he had gone for a little walk before morning in order to stretch his legs, he was aware of the plan. He had a strict adherence to the plans. Without a doubt, he would return by 7 o'clock, which was the time that they had agreed upon for their departure. However, as the minutes ticked by steadily, a feeling of dread started to make its way into the room. There was a passing of 5:30. Then it is 6 o'clock. Next, it is 6:30. Colin has not been seen or heard from since. It was not a phone call. He had not sent a text message. Just now, he had disappeared. Concerns began to arise among the friends. Colin's behavior was utterly out of character in this regard. It was he who was accountable, the one who was an adept navigator. Without informing anyone of his intended destination, he would not just disappear into the night in the middle of the Siberian wilderness without a known destination. In no way did it make any sense at all. 7 o'clock in the morning, which was the time that they had agreed to leave, Colin was still absent. With the passage of time, the original feeling of worry had developed into a full-blown concern. The region immediately surrounding the cabin was the subject of a speedy search that his friends conducted. They inquired about his name. The outhouse was examined once more by them. As the frost covered the ground, they searched for any footprints that might have been left behind. And still, they discovered nothing. It appeared as though he had simply exited the cabin and vanished from existence. It was as if he had passed away. They were aware that they needed to seek assistance at that point. Simply waiting around was no longer an option for them. A brief message was written by them before they left, and it was affixed to the front door of the cabin for safekeeping. The sender of the message was Colin. The note read something along the lines of, "If you come back and see this, we've gone to get help. We're looking for you. Please stay here or let someone know you're safe." After posting the note, the three friends left the cabin and went straight to the nearest police station in Arshan to let them know that their friend was missing. It was taken quite seriously by the local police department. Unusual was the disappearance of a young and experienced American outdoorsman who had been out in the wilderness. Almost immediately, they started a comprehensive search operation. An enormous search area was conducted, which encompassed the thick forest that surrounded the settlement of Arshan and extended all the way up the slopes of Love Peak itself. There were scores of local volunteers, including some individuals from the group that Colin had worked with in the past, who participated in the massive effort that was undertaken by law enforcement authorities, professional rescue teams, and other volunteers. Every single one of them was really worried since they were aware of how skilled he was. When Colin's family returned to the United States, they were confronted with the phone call that every parent dreads receiving. It was reported to them that their son had gone missing in Siberia. In response, they expressed complete and utter astonishment. A Colin? Is it lost? It appeared to be impossible. It turned out to be the young man who had spent years researching the environment in question. The individual in question was not a careless traveler who strayed off the path. It was almost as if he was an expert in the area. They made frantic efforts to obtain information, but in light of the fact that they were located thousands of miles away, they felt absolutely useless. They had no choice except to wait, hope, and pray for a solution. The search went on, day after day, without stopping. Due to the extreme weather conditions, which included freezing winds and snow on occasion, the search conditions were considered to be challenging and risky. In the Siberian wilderness, the expanse of the forest seemed intimidating. Out there, it is possible for a person to vanish without ever being located. The hope of discovering Colin alive began to dwindle as the days continued to pass, with one day turning into 2, then 3, and finally ending up being a full week. In the end, a breakthrough occurred on Monday, April 4th, which was 8 full days after Colin had vanished from the cabin over the previous week. Around 1 mile distant from the cabin, a group of people were searching through a part of forest while looking for the missing person. It was a heavily populated and challenging location to get through. A little clearing appeared in front of them as they made their way through the dense underbrush and the trees that were blocking their path. And in the midst of that expansive clearing, they caught sight of something. It was, as the search party got closer, that they realized their worst fears were correct. Yes, it was Colin. And it was too late for him. In the middle of the clearing, he was discovered lying on his back in a flat position. An odd, almost posed stance was arranged on his body, and it was quite peculiar. His right arm was also extended, but it was bent slightly and brought closer to his body. His left arm was stretched out straight to his side, and his right arm was also extended. At the same time, he had both of his palms gripped into a firm, tight fist. After conducting a more thorough investigation, the first responders discovered a number of unsettling details. On both of his wrists and on both of his hands, there were wounds and abrasions that were clearly evident. The pattern of these injuries appeared to be what a medical examiner would refer to as restraint marks. It appeared as though someone or something had been holding him down with a great deal of force. On the front of his neck, there were also scrapes and abrasions that were present. His attire, which included a thermal shirt with long sleeves, heavy-duty hiking pants, and his robust hiking boots, was ripped and torn in multiple places, which indicated that he had been involved in a violent conflict. In addition to that, there was a peculiar and insignificant information that would turn out to be of great importance. No socks were on Colin's feet at the time. Inside his hiking boots, which were tightly knotted, he was wearing his bare feet. Despite the fact that this may appear to be a trivial matter, for everyone who knew Colin, it was a significant warning sign. A substantial amount of scar tissue was left behind on Colin's ankles as a result of the procedures that he had previously undergone on both of them. It was something that he had mentioned to his friends and family on numerous occasions that if he did not wear thick socks, the scar tissue would scrape against the inside of his boots, causing him to experience excruciating discomfort. Never in his life did he go trekking without his socks on. He adhered to this norm in his daily life. Nevertheless, the state of the body was the aspect that the medical staff who initially inspected it found to be the most puzzling. It is reasonable to anticipate that a body would exhibit substantial signs of decomposition after being exposed to the environment and the animals for a period of 8 days in the remote regions of Siberia. Colin's body, on the other hand, exhibited hardly none. According to the remarks of one official, all of his wounds, including the cuts and abrasions on his wrists and neck, appeared to be fresh. It appeared as if the struggle and his death had occurred no more than a few moments ago. To put it succinctly, the scene did not give the impression that the person had become disoriented and had given in to the elements. It seemed as though the individual had lately been involved in a serious physical altercation, one that he had been unsuccessful in winning. The scene appeared to be that of a homicide. The Russian authorities proceeded with a stunning speed to shut the case, despite the fact that there was a lot of evidence that was both bizarre and persuasive. Their first hypothesis, which swiftly evolved into their official conclusion, was that all 3 of Colin's buddies had to have been involved in the crime. However, the friends were brought in for further interrogation, and they all denied having any involvement with Colin's death. Additionally, they all volunteered to take lie detector tests, which they all passed after they were given the opportunity to do so. It appeared as though the Russian authorities had lost interest in any other possible instances of foul play now that their major suspects had been implicated. Rapidly, they came to an agreement on a conclusive and formal answer. As a result, they came to the conclusion that Colin must have been under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or both. During this changed state, they asserted that he must have wandered out of the cabin in a state of disorientation, become disoriented in the woods, and ultimately succumbed to hypothermia. It was determined that the case was closed. He died of a frozen state. The story has come to an end. The answer that was provided to Colin's parents was not only unsatisfactory, but it was also an insult to their son's memory. They were familiar with Colin. He was not a person who acted recklessly. It was not true that he was a drug user. Furthermore, he was an absolute master when it came to getting around in that particular region of Siberia. The concept that he would simply wander off and become so hopelessly lost that he would die of exposure a mile away from his cabin appeared to be totally absurd. The official account did not make sense, and there were an excessive number of questions that remained unresolved. All of the evidence, including the clenched fists, the restraining marks, the missing socks, the wounds that appeared to be new, and the absence of decomposition, did not fit into the straightforward story of a guy who died from freezing to death. Because they were unwilling to accept the official decision, Colin's parents made the decision to take matters into their own hands. They had the knowledge that they required an impartial and objective opinion. Therefore, they decided to use a private forensic laboratory that is situated in the United States and has a stellar reputation. They arranged for all of the material from the Russian autopsy, including the reports, the photographs, and the findings of the toxicological test, to be delivered to this laboratory for a comprehensive examination. Whether the conclusion reached by the Russians was correct, or whether something far more ominous had occurred to their son, they were interested in being informed. The American laboratory started its investigation, and it didn't take them long to discover significant flaws in the official position taken by the Russian government. As a matter of fact, their discoveries entirely disassembled it, each component by component. The toxicological report was the first thing that they looked at. The Russian authorities had proposed the idea that Colin was either under the influence of alcohol or drugs. After doing an analysis of the toxicology data, the laboratory in the United States came to the conclusion that this is unquestionably not true. Colin was not under the effect of alcohol at any point in it. When he was sober, an extremely minute and insignificant quantity of THC, which is the psychoactive component of marijuana, was discovered in his urine. On the other hand, the level was so low that it suggested that he had probably consumed it quite a few days, if not a week or perhaps more, before to his disappearance. It is quite unlikely that it would have had any kind of psychotropic impact on him on the night that he goes missing. This discovery was in direct and total opposition to the fundamental tenet of the hypothesis that the Russian police had been using. Second, the laboratory investigated the root of the death. The official diagnosis was hypothermia as the cause of death. But the forensic pathologists from the United States arrived at a different conclusion. According to the evidence that was found in the photographs taken during the autopsy, particularly the abrasions that were found on his neck, as well as other internal markers, they came to the conclusion that Colin did not die as a result of being exposed to the cold. All of the signals, on the other hand, pointed to a considerably more violent conclusion. Based on their findings, they concluded that suffocation was the most likely cause of death. He was the victim of a homicide. Until the moment he passed away, his capacity to breathe was severely restricted because someone had either suffocated him or crushed his airway. This brings us to the third and possibly most disturbing point. The laboratory examined the condition of Colin's body when it was discovered. It was corroborated by them that the initial responders had noticed the nearly complete absence of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries, and the fact that his body had not been touched by any animals that were foraging for food, which is quite unusual for a body that has been left in the woods for more than a week. In light of this information, they came to a conclusion that was shocking. It indicated that Colin had not passed away on the night that he could not be found. It indicated that he had been alive for the majority of the 8 days that hundreds of people had been searching for him, if not all of them simultaneously. The evidence strongly suggested that he had died within a very short time, most likely just a few hours before his body was discovered in that area on April 4th. This was the conclusion that was reached by using the evidence. These fresh discoveries from the American laboratory revealed a horrifying and devastating new picture of what must have occurred to Colin Madsen because of his circumstances. The situation was not one in which a hiker became disoriented. This was a case of kidnapping and murdering the victim. Consequently, let us make an effort to reconstruct the events by using this new evidence that is more exact. On March 28, between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning, Colin awoke. This occurred somewhere in the pre-dawn hours of the day. He climbed out of his bed in a stealthy manner and exited the cabin. Utilizing the outhouse, which was located a short distance away, would be the most reasonable explanation for this behavior. His attire was not appropriate for a hike. Neither of his belongings were taken by him. Even his socks were not put on by him. The intention was for this to be a little excursion, nothing more than a minute or two, and then straight back to bed. As soon as he went out into the chilly and gloomy morning of Siberia, however, he discovered that he was not alone. They were waiting in the shadows, and it was either someone or some individuals. The fact that a violent struggle took place is something that we are aware of, but we do not know whether they ambushed him or whether they enticed him away from the cabin. These are the telltale indicators of a guy who is battling for his life. The shredded clothing, the abrasions on his hands and wrists, and the clenched fists. On the other hand, he was ultimately defeated. He had been kidnapped. Probably the most terrifying aspect of this enigma is what transpired after that with him. He was kidnapped from the environment surrounding the cabin and held captive for close to 8 days in a location unknown. This is where he was abducted. Why was he taken away from us? We are unable to provide responses to these queries. He was being detained against his will for a period of 8 days, during which time his friends, his family, and a large search party were making frantic efforts to locate him. Imagine the suffering that he must have been subjected to during that period of time. After that, his assailant or assailants murdered him on or around April 4th, which was the day that his body was discovered. Suffocation was the result. Following his passing, his body was relocated and positioned in that area in the forest, which was approximately 1 mile away from the cabin. Where is that? Would you say that the location was one that was chosen on purpose? Was the intention to make it simple to locate in order to convey some kind of message? Or was it simply a spot that was convenient for him to be left? When he is placed on his back with his arms extended, it gives the impression that he was placed there on purpose, rather than being a body that was simply abandoned. Therefore, the most important question is, who would do this and why would they do it? One theory, which is supported by a significant number of individuals, suggests that the Russian government or some local authorities are responsible. In Siberia, it was discovered that Colin, who had a strong commitment to protecting the environment, had taken part in at least one protest that was staged inside a peaceful setting. An unauthorized development in the area of Lake Baikal was the target of the protest. Following the conclusion of this demonstration, it is believed that Colin was issued a formal written warning by the Russian police, instructing him to refrain from attending any such rallies of this nature. What if this is the reason for it? Is it true that he was considered a problematic American activist? What happened to him? Was he singled out, kidnapped for questioning, and then murdered? This is a somewhat unsettling idea. It is possible that this is the reason why the official investigation was so quick to close off any line of inquiry that did not entail a straightforward accident. It's possible that a failed probe was actually a deliberate attempt to cover up the truth. On the other hand, this idea is not without its flaws. With so many other people participating in the demonstration, why would the government single out Colin? And why would they pick to kidnap him on a night when he was with 3 of his closest friends, individuals who would immediately notice his absence and raise the alarm if they were to find him missing? An operation that is being carried out in secret appears to be carried out in a very poor manner. There are other hypotheses that suggest it could have been a crime of opportunity, a robbery that went awry, or a personal quarrel with a nearby resident that we are unaware of. However, none of these hypotheses adequately explain the peculiar and protracted character of the crime, which consisted of the 8-day period of captivity prior to the murder. It was not surprising to see how the Russian authorities would respond to the discoveries that were discovered by the American laboratory. They were entirely disregarded by anyone. They remained steadfast in their judgment that the death was the result of hypothermia brought on by an accident. However, the investigation in Russia has not yet been concluded. This is not a riddle that needs to be solved for them. Those who were close to Colin described the event as a complete nightmare. Not only did they suffer the loss of their good buddy in the most heinous manner, but they also had to go through the agony of being the major suspects in his killing, even if it was only for a little period of time or for a short period of time. The shocking events that transpired over that week are likely to remain with them for the rest of their lives. The anguish that Colin's parents are experiencing is never-ending. Despite their best efforts, they have been unable to achieve justice for their son. The government of Russia does not give any cooperation, does not provide any fresh information, and there is no possibility that the case will ever be reopened. They are left with the horrific knowledge that their kid was murdered, but it is possible that they will never know who was responsible for the crime or why it was committed. When it comes to this investigation, they are forced to consider the same questions over and over again. Who was hiding in the shadows outside of that cabin in the early morning hours when it was completely dark? To what location did they take Colin? And during those 8 days when they were unable to find him, before they killed him and left him deep within that huge and merciless Siberian wilderness, what did they do to him? You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? On the morning of Sunday, the 17th of June, 2018, a 35-year-old man named Tristan Baudet woke up early. The first thing he did was grab his phone to check the weather forecast for Orange County, California. Orange County is a sprawling, beautiful suburb nestled between the massive cities of Los Angeles and San Diego. It was here that Tristan, his 36-year-old wife, Erica Wu, and their 2 little girls, who were just 2 and 4 years old, had built their life. And on this particular morning, which just so happened to be Father's Day, Tristan was hoping for good news. He had a plan. He wanted to take his whole family out for a perfect day at the beach to celebrate. He watched as the weather app loaded on his phone and a smile spread across his face. The forecast was for clear skies and sunshine all day. But honestly, even if the app had predicted rain and cold, Tristan probably would have tried to convince everyone to go to the beach anyway. For Tristan, being outdoors was his happy place. It didn't matter if it was hiking in the mountains, camping under the stars, or just tossing a frisbee in a park. If he was outside, he was content. This love for nature was something he had already passed down to his 2 young daughters. They were his little adventure sidekicks, always eager to explore the world with their dad. It made Tristan incredibly happy to see them falling in love with the same things he did. His wife Erica, she enjoyed the outdoors too, but maybe not with the same level of passion as Tristan. But that was perfectly fine with him. Tristan was the kind of person who just went with the flow. He would make small adjustments to make sure she was comfortable. For instance, whenever they went camping, he was happy to rough it in a tent on the hard ground. But he would always pack a big, full-sized inflatable mattress just for Erica. And it wasn't just about the mattress. It was about his entire personality. Erica adored him for it. He was just so easygoing and accepting of people as they were. He never judged anyone. He was just at peace with the world. In fact, that exact quality was what first drew Erica to him all those years ago. They had met back in high school. Some mutual friends had set them up because Tristan needed a date for a school dance. Erica agreed to go with him, and the night of the dance was the first time she ever laid eyes on him. And he was quite a sight. Over the summer, he had shot up a few inches in height, but hadn't quite filled out yet, so he was tall and very lanky. And for this dance, he was completely overdressed in a full tuxedo, but he wasn't self-conscious about it at all. He was just genuinely excited to be there with a date. And all night long, Tristan owned that tuxedo, dancing with all his lanky, gangly glory as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He made it his mission to make sure Erica had a great time, and she absolutely did. After that night, the 2 of them were pretty much inseparable. Their lives took them on impressive paths. Erica went on to study at Stanford University and became a successful OBGYN doctor. Tristan became a brilliant and widely published scientist. He even held a patent related to vaccine delivery. On paper, his resume was unbelievable, stacked with achievements, but all that success never changed the core of who Tristan was. His colleagues at the lab, who all loved him, found it hilarious. Here was this genius chemist working on cutting-edge cancer treatments, a guy doing incredibly complex research, who was also this laid-back person who walked around the lab starting most of his sentences with the word dude. By early afternoon on that Father's Day, the Baudet family had made their way to a local beach. Erica settled into a beach chair with a book, while Tristan and the two little girls set up a sunshade right at the edge of the water. They started digging in the sand, building little castles. Every so often, Erica would look up from her book and watch them. She'd see them laughing as they dug. Then they'd suddenly abandon their project and run into the shallow surf, shrieking with delight as they tried to outrun these small, gentle waves that crashed around their ankles. At one point, Erica looked up and saw her daughters having the time of their lives, and then she saw Tristan look over at her. He flashed her this huge, happy grin. And in that one single moment, watching her family, Erica felt a sense of pure contentment wash over her. It was a feeling that didn't always come easily to her. Unlike Tristan, who could just relax and enjoy life as it came, Erica was a constant worrier. This anxiety traced all the way back to when she was just 8 years old. That was the year she lost her father. It was a deeply traumatic event that had devastated her family and cast a long shadow over her childhood. Ever since then, she had lived with a persistent, quiet fear that no matter how good things were, something terrible was always just around the corner, waiting to ruin it all. But sitting there on the beach, seeing that smile on her husband's face, and hearing the laughter of her children, that fear melted away. It was a perfect moment. So Erica put her book down, got up from her chair, and ran to join her family in the water. She had no way of knowing that her deepest fear was about to become a reality. 4 days later, on Thursday, June 21st, the atmosphere at their home was very different. Erica was trying to study for a huge medical exam she was scheduled to take the very next day. But with Tristan and their two energetic daughters at home, the house was loud and chaotic. It was impossible for her to focus. Tristan could see the stress on her face. He also knew that on top of the exam, they were only a week away from a massive life change. They were moving to San Francisco. They had already put a deposit down on a new house up there, closer to some of their family. It was a good move for them, but it added another huge layer of pressure. Looking at his wife, Tristan knew she needed a break. She needed some peace and quiet to study and prepare. And so, he came up with a plan. He decided he would take the girls and get out of the house for the weekend. He made a couple of quick phone calls. A little while later, he went to Erica and told her what he had arranged. He had booked a campsite up in Malibu, California. Malibu is another one of those iconic Southern California towns about an hour-and-a-half drive north of Orange County. It's known for being a wealthy enclave where celebrities live, and he told her that he had also called his brother-in-law, Scott, who had 2 young sons of his own, ages 3 and 5. The plan was for all of them to go camping together for the weekend. Erica was incredibly grateful. She really did need the time and space to study. But at the same time, a familiar sense of worry started to creep in. Tristan often took the girls on little adventures, but he had never taken them camping overnight by himself without her there. Her first instinct was to object, to say it wasn't a good idea. But Tristan, who knew his wife so well, reassured her. He told her not to worry. He promised he would take great care of the kids. He explained that it was a very public, well-known campground with lots of other people around. He promised it was totally safe. Eventually, Erica was convinced. So Tristan started packing up the car. He loaded in all the camping gear, the kids' toys, and their little bikes. As he worked, the girls were buzzing with excitement about their big camping trip. But Erica couldn't shake a bad feeling. A part of her was silently hoping that something would happen and they would have to cancel the trip. She just felt like something bad was about to happen. But nothing happened to stop them. After the car was all packed and the girls were buckled into their car seats, Tristan came over to Erica. He gave her a kiss goodbye and told her he'd see her in a couple of days. He wished her good luck on her test. And with that, he got into the driver's seat, backed out of the driveway, and headed up the road towards Malibu. Erica stood and watched until the car disappeared from sight. That night, Erica studied late into the evening before finally going to bed. The next morning, she woke up early. She was feeling anxious about the test, and she was still worried about Tristan and the girls. As she was getting ready for her day, she heard a loud, insistent knock on her front door. She glanced at the clock. It was only 6:45 inches the morning. It made no sense. No one should be knocking on her door at this hour. Maybe it was Tristan, but if it were him, he would have just used his key. Apprehensively, she walked to the front of the house and opened the door. The moment she saw who was standing on her porch, she knew. She knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. Erica would later look back on that moment opening the door. And even though it was irrational, she would sometimes think to herself, what if I had just never opened the door? Would this nightmare still have happened? But she did open the door, and standing there was her sister-in-law, Priscilla. Priscilla lived an hour and a half away and was completely unannounced. Her face was frantic and tear-streaked. And then Priscilla gave Erica the most heartbreaking news a person could ever receive. The words were so shocking, so world-shattering, that Erica's mind literally could not process them. She kept thinking, this can't be true. There has to be a mistake. But there was no mistake. Erica would not be taking her medical exam that day. Instead, she got into the car with Priscilla, and they began the long, silent drive to Malibu. The day before, Tristan and his two little girls had arrived at the entrance to Malibu Creek State Park. When you think of Malibu, you probably picture mansions on the beach. But just inland from the coast, the landscape changes dramatically. It becomes rugged and wild, full of deep canyons and dense forests. And nestled right in the middle of all this wilderness is the state park. Tristan and his brother-in-law Scott pulled up to the gate, checked in with the park rangers, and were given directions to their campsites. They had reserved 2 spots right next to each other. A campsite in a place like this is usually just a simple, square plot of dirt, maybe with a fire pit. It's just enough space to pitch a tent. So Tristan and Scott drove across the campground to their assigned spots. But as soon as they got there, Tristan realized the spots weren't very good. They were located right next to the portable toilets, so there was a bit of a smell, and a lot of people were walking back and forth. The ground was also on a slight slope, which would make sleeping uncomfortable. It just wasn't ideal. Scott agreed, so he decided to go back and talk to the rangers to see if they could move. He drove back to the entrance, spoke with a ranger, and it turned out to be no problem at all. The ranger told him there were 2 other open sites on the far side of the park, and they could just swap their reservation. So Tristan and Scott packed everything back up and drove over to the new spots. And these ones were perfect. They were tucked away at the base of a huge sloping canyon wall, far from any bathrooms or foot traffic. It felt private and secluded, and the ground was perfectly flat. The 2 men were thrilled. They started unloading their cars and setting up their tents, while the 4 kids ran around playing and riding their small bikes. Once the tents were up, they built a fire in the fire pit, which was situated right between the 2 campsites. Scott would be sleeping in his tent with his 2 sons, and Tristan would be in his tent with his 2 daughters. As the sun went down, they all gathered around the fire. They roasted hot dogs and made s'mores, that classic camping treat of marshmallows, chocolate, so graham crackers. The dads told funny jokes and some not too spooky stories. Before long, all four kids were completely exhausted. So Scott and Tristan each took their own children and tucked them into their sleeping bags inside the tents. After the kids were settled, the two men came back out to the fire. Tristan had brought some pre-made cocktails, and he shared one with Scott. They sat there for a while, just enjoying the quiet of the night and each other's company. Tristan talked a lot about the upcoming move to San Francisco, and Scott was happy to just sit and listen. Eventually, they were both tired too. They decided it was time to call it a night. They carefully put out the fire. Scott gave Tristan a hug and told him he loved him. Then the two men went to their separate tents. As Scott climbed into his tent with his sleeping sons, he looked across the now dark fire pit towards Tristan's tent. He could just make out the silhouette of Tristan climbing inside with his girls. After seeing that, Scott zipped up his own tent, lay down, and within about 15 minutes, he was fast asleep. Just before sunrise the next morning, around 4:45 a.m., Scott suddenly woke up. He thought he had heard a loud noise, but he was groggy and couldn't quite place what it was. He lay there in the dark, listening. And as he got his bearings, he realized that one of Tristan's daughters was crying in the other tent. Now, this wasn't immediately alarming. Kids cry. He figured Tristan would comfort her in a minute and she would go back to sleep. But the crying didn't stop. It just continued. Scott knew that Tristan was a notoriously heavy sleeper, so he started to think, okay, maybe he just hasn't woken up yet. That must be why he's not calming his daughter down. So Scott carefully got out of his sleeping bag, trying not to wake his own sons. He unzipped his tent and stepped outside. The air was cold and it was still dark. He couldn't see anything inside of Tristan's tent. He walked over to it, and by the time he got there, he could hear Tristan's daughter still crying, clear as day. Scott called out in a loud whisper, "Hey, Tristan. Tristan, wake up!" But there was no response. Nothing. With the little girl still crying just on the other side of the thin nylon wall, Scott decided he had to look inside. He walked around to the front of the tent, found the zipper, and pulled it open. He peered inside, but it was too dark to see clearly. But even in the dim pre-dawn light, he could make out the shapes. He could see Tristan lying still in the middle of the tent. On either side of him were his two daughters. It looked like the 2-year-old was the one who was crying, and the 4-year-old was awake too, whimpering and trying her best to comfort her little sister. As Scott was trying to figure out what was going on, the two little girls turned and looked up at him. When they saw him, they both started saying the same word over and over. Wet. 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 Scott had no idea what they meant. He was starting to feel a surge of panic. He knew something was very wrong. He reached into the tent and started shaking Tristan's shoulder, saying, "Hey, wake up," but the second he touched him, he knew. He knew instantly. Tristan wasn't sleeping. Tristan was dead. And his two little girls were sitting right next to him in a pool of his blood. Just before Scott had woken up, someone somewhere nearby in the darkness of the park had fired a gun. One of the bullets from that gun had traveled through the night, pierced the thin wall of Tristan's tent, and had struck him directly in the head as he slept peacefully between his two daughters. About 2 hours after that, Priscilla arrived on Erica's doorstep to tell her what had happened. To tell her that her husband was gone and that her two little girls were now going to grow up without a father, just like she did. The news didn't just break Erica's heart, it completely shattered her world. A 42-year-old man named Anthony Rauda was eventually arrested and charged with Tristan's murder. Rauda had a long and violent criminal history, and at the time of the shooting, he was living illegally off the grid deep in the canyons of that very same park. When police finally caught up to him, he was in possession of a rifle. And ballistics tests later confirmed that it was the same rifle that had fired the bullet that killed Tristan. His trial has been a long and difficult process. It's been repeatedly delayed because Rauda keeps firing his defense attorneys, Although he insists that he is innocent, his behavior in court has done nothing to help his case. He has been so violent and erratic during his court appearances that he has to be strapped into a special chair by his wrists and legs. They even have to put a device called a spit hood over his head to stop him from spitting at or biting people. Assuming that he was the shooter, which the evidence strongly suggests he was, the motive appears to be completely random. It's believed he didn't know Tristan at all. He just, for whatever reason, fired his gun that night. Maybe he was firing recklessly into the darkness, or maybe he intentionally aimed at the tent. We don't know for sure. But either way, one of his bullets found its target, and Tristan Baudet was killed simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if the story wasn't already tragic enough, one more detail emerged that made it even more distressing. Tristan's death was not the first shooting to happen in or around Malibu Creek State Park. In the year leading up to his murder, there had been an astounding 6 other shootings in the immediate area. And 2 of those shootings happened inside the very same campground where Tristan was killed. None of those other shootings had been fatal, but in all 6 cases, the person or people responsible were never caught. And it seemed the local police hadn't put much effort into investigating them. It wasn't until a father was killed in his tent next to his children that the stories of all these other unsolved shootings finally came to light. People started looking at a map and connecting the dots. They realized there was a pattern. There was a rogue shooter who had been active in that exact area for a year, and the public had never been warned. The campground was never closed. No one was told that there was a potential danger lurking in the wilderness there. And the big question everyone had was, why? We may get answers to those questions during Anthony Rauda's trial, where he's being charged not only with Tristan's murder, but for all those other shootings as well. In the meantime, Erica has filed a $90 million lawsuit against several government agencies. Her lawsuit argues that her husband had no idea about the threat that existed in that park. If the authorities had just put up a single sign, a single warning to the public, Tristan, being the protective father he was, would have never ever taken his children there. And he would still be alive today. That lawsuit is still ongoing. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In the far northwestern corner of Canada lies one of the largest and most isolated regions on Earth, the Northwest Territories. To understand just how vast and empty this place really is, consider this. The entire country of Germany has a population of roughly 83 million people. The Northwest Territories is nearly 4 times larger than Germany, yet only around 50,000 people live there. It is a land that remains almost completely wild, defined by dense forests, towering mountains, violent rivers, and enormous lakes. Roaming through that wilderness are some of the largest predators in North America. Even for the most experienced outdoorsmen and women, the Northwest Territories can be an incredibly dangerous and unforgiving place to survive. And hidden deep within this already hazardous landscape lies a place many people refuse to enter at all. It's an 11,000 square mile stretch of pure, untamed wilderness known as the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the area became part of the Nahanni National Park Reserve. But don't let the word park fool you. This is not the kind of place families casually visit for a weekend camping trip. There are no hotels, no lodges, no visitor centers, and perhaps most importantly, there are no roads leading into or out of the valley. The only ways to reach it are by plane, by boat, or by attempting an extremely long and brutally difficult trek through the wilderness. But for those who are brave enough and willing to make the monumental effort to get inside this valley, they're rewarded with the chance to explore one of the most stunningly beautiful places on the entire planet. Because this section of the world has remained almost completely untouched by human hands, it represents nature in its most raw and purest form. However, there's a catch. The Nahanni Valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the few native tribes that have tried to settle inside the valley have all met with strange and unsettling fate. Some, like the Naha tribe, simply vanished without a trace. It was as if they disappeared overnight. They left behind all of their shelters, their food stores, and their supplies. They were just gone, and to this day, no one has any idea what happened to them. Other tribes have abruptly fled the valley, claiming they were being terrorized and stalked by mysterious creatures that lurked in the deep woods. They spoke of strange white demons and enormous wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, these stories sound like folklore, and it's entirely possible that's all they are. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things began to happen in the Nahanni Valley that were definitely not folklore. These events were real, they were documented, and they were horrifying. And, depending on how you look at it, they might just lend some credibility to the ancient beliefs of the native tribes, the belief that there is something truly evil lurking out in those forests, something that we just don't understand. It all started back in 1904. Three brothers named Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they were going to head into the Nahanni Valley to search for gold. Their logic was simple. Since so few people had ever set foot inside the valley, they figured that if there was any gold to be found, it almost certainly hadn't been discovered yet. And so, after a very long and exhausting journey that involved sled dogs, trains, and even homemade boats, they finally managed to slip into the valley. They found themselves on a waterway known as the Flat River, which cuts right through the heart of the Nahanni Valley. The name Flat River is a bit ironic because it's anything but flat. In certain sections, it's more like a raging rapid. But either way, the three brothers were on their boat, making their way up the river. At some point, they pulled their boat onto the riverbank and set up a camp. Once their camp was established, they went down to the water's edge and placed their gold sluices in the river. A gold sluice is a long, narrow box, usually made of wood, with a strainer on one end. Gold miners submerge it in the water and then shovel sediment from the riverbed into a funnel at one end. The water and fine dirt flow out, but the strainer is designed to catch any heavier materials like gold nuggets. And so, the three brothers got their sluices set up and started the hard work of looking for gold. Almost immediately, they hit pay dirt. The river was filled with gold. They worked all day and into the night, pulling nugget after nugget from the water. The next morning, they did the same thing. By the time all of their containers were literally filled to the brim with gold, they decided it was time to head back, cash in their find, and then plan a return trip. So, they packed up their tent, gathered all their supplies, and carefully loaded everything, including their newfound fortune, back into their boat. They pushed off from the shore and got back out onto the Flat River. But very early into their journey back, disaster struck. The boat capsized in the powerful rapids. The force of the water was so strong that it actually broke the boat apart. The vessel sank, and most of their supplies, including every last bit of their gold, went down with it. The three brothers managed to survive. They grabbed what supplies they could, like their rifle, some lumber from the wreckage, and their mining gear, and swam everything to the shore. They collapsed on the riverbank, catching their breath, completely devastated by the loss of their gold, but thankful to be alive. They still had enough supplies to survive. They figured the only thing they could do was try to go back to their original campsite and see if they could find some more gold. They still had one of their sluices. So, using some of the lumber they had salvaged from their broken boat, and by cutting down a few trees, they managed to fashion a new, makeshift boat. They hopped back on the Flat River and paddled their way back up to the spot where they had found so much gold just days before. They set up their camp again and put their sluice back in the water. But this time, they didn't find a single piece of gold. They spent the entire day searching, but it was a deeply disappointing effort. They had already lost a fortune, and now it seemed their luck had completely run out. That night, as they sat around their campfire, they decided that the next day they would just pack up and leave. So, the next morning, they got up, packed their gear, and got back on the new boat they had built. This time, they were able to successfully navigate the river, make their way out of the valley, and return to their homes. As soon as they got back, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, immediately started talking about going back to the Nahanni Valley. They knew there was more gold out there. There was no question about it. Sure, they didn't find it on that second attempt, but they had seen it with their own eyes. Charlie, the oldest brother, also wanted the gold, but he was more cautious. He felt like their first trip had been a very close call. The boat flipping over could have easily cost them their lives. He just didn't know if it was a good idea to risk it again. He told his brothers that he wasn't going to go. They could go if they wanted, but he was going to stay behind. Several months went by, and Willie and Frank spent that time meticulously preparing for their next expedition into the valley. Finally, in 1905, they were ready. Willie and Frank, along with a third man named Robert Weir, a friend of theirs who was taking Charlie's place, set off. The three men made their way back up into the valley. They didn't tell anyone exactly how long they planned to be gone, so when weeks passed with no word from them, Charlie wasn't particularly concerned. He knew how much gold there was to be had in the Nahanni Valley. He just figured they must have struck it rich again and had decided to stay out there for the long term, maybe through the summer or even into the next year. He wasn't worried, and because he wasn't worried, nobody else was either. And so, the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into a year. Still, no one had heard a single word from the three men. Not from Willie, not from Frank, and not from Robert. But still, Charlie insisted that nothing could be wrong. He reasoned that there were three of them out there, they were all incredibly experienced outdoorsmen, and there was a ton of gold to be found. He was sure they were just having incredible success, acquiring a huge amount of gold, and that everyone would see them in the next couple of months, and everything would be just fine. But then, a whole other year went by. They had now been out there for 2 full years, and no one had heard from them. At this point, even Charlie had to admit that something might be wrong. He thought to himself, okay, it's time. I have to go out there and see if they're okay. And so, he rounded up 4 other people from his town and mounted a search expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to find his 2 brothers and Robert Weir. After yet another long and difficult journey, Charlie and his search party finally made it into the Nahanni Valley and onto the Flat River. They began making their way upstream, a treacherous journey through the river's rapids. The whole time, they were constantly scanning the riverbanks on both sides, hoping to see some sign of life. They were looking for any indication at all that the 3 men were out there and safe. But they saw nothing. They traveled all the way up to the very end of the Flat River, or rather the beginning of it, where it splits off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. Once they turned onto the South Nahanni, they began to travel downstream. Again, they scanned the banks on either side, searching for any sign of the 3 missing men. But there was nothing. Then, the river they were on took a very sharp turn. It's a place that's actually known as the Big Bend, a sharp 45-degree turn that dumps you directly into a 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, the South Nahanni River is about 350 miles long, and along its course, the water passes through 4 distinct canyons. They are labeled, in order, 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon. And these canyons are absolutely massive. The sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot straight up, sometimes as high as 3,000 feet above the water. And in some parts, the water itself is just as deep, plunging thousands of feet down. Second Canyon is unique because its cliff faces are about as sheer as you can get, and they butt up almost directly against the water, leaving very little shoreline on either side. Once you enter this 10-mile stretch, you are essentially boxed in. You have thousands of feet of deep dark water below you, these massive imposing cliffs on either side, and really nowhere to go. You have to navigate the entire length of this section of river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from your boat. And all along these cliffs, high up on both sides, you can see dark openings. These are the entrances to massive cave systems that wind their way through the insides of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. Because of how incredibly difficult it is to not only get to the Nahanni Valley, but also to access these high-up cave entrances, no one has really gone inside most of them. We simply don't know what's inside those caves, save for the few that are low enough for people to explore. So as you pass through Second Canyon, it almost feels like you're being watched. There are all these dark openings looking down on you, but you can't see into them. You're just forced to continue down this 10-mile stretch of water with nowhere to go and no way to escape the feeling that something is watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker. That's another feature of being in the canyon. The huge cliff walls block out most of the sunlight. So they would have paddled into this canyon, the light would have dimmed, and the wind would have picked up. It's very windy inside Second Canyon. It was a dark, strange, and unsettling setting for them to be in. They would have been looking at these small, narrow strips of shoreline on either side, barely big enough for a boat to be beached, searching for any sign of life. But they didn't see anything. As they continued to make their way down this 10-mile stretch, getting closer and closer to the entrance of First Canyon, the next canyon in the series, the riverbanks started to widen slightly. There were some trees, and you could actually beach a boat there. And it was there, on the left-hand side, just before the exit of Second Canyon, that they noticed something. There was a tent, perched among some trees. The search party naturally steered their boat directly over to that shoreline. They hopped out, but as soon as their feet touched the land and they got a clearer view of the tent and the area around it, they saw it. There was a body clearly lying on the ground just outside of the tent. Charlie and the rest of the search party ran over. As soon as they got up close, they could tell that the body was missing its head. They also saw that the clothes on the body were totally charred and burned. The body was positioned in a way that suggested the person was reaching with their right arm when they died. And just outside the reach of that right arm was a rifle propped up against a tree. They walked around the first body and went towards the back of the tent where the opening was, and there they found another body. This one was also badly decomposed, and it was positioned halfway in the tent and halfway out. There was a blanket partially covering the body. When they moved the blanket, they saw that this body too was missing its head. So, Charlie and the search party continued to search the area around the camp, hoping they might find the heads of the two bodies so they could try to identify who they were. But they never found the heads. However, they did find some personal effects, both in the pockets of the two bodies and inside the tent, that confirmed their worst fears. These were Charlie's brothers. As for the third man who had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite. In fact, he would never officially be found. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be discovered several months later, and it was attributed to Robert, though that was never 100% confirmed. The only other interesting thing that was found at the campsite was a carving in a nearby tree. It just said, "We have found a fine prospect," which indicated that Charlie's brothers had in fact found gold. But there was no gold to be found. Not on their bodies, not in their camp, and not in the river nearby. There was nothing. Charlie and the search party left the valley and got in touch with the mounted police. The police came out to the site where the brothers had been found and launched an investigation. Ultimately, they came to the conclusion that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had simply starved to death. And then, after they had perished, animals had come and taken parts of them away, which would explain why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie didn't believe that for a second. He was convinced they had been attacked by native tribes in the area. But the police weren't buying that theory. They insisted it was a natural occurrence, a tragic accident, and that was that. When the story of the two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy. The public was very divided about what they thought had really happened. There was a percentage of people who believed that the partial skeleton found downstream was not Robert Weir. They believed that he hadn't died at all. Instead, he had murdered the two brothers, decapitated them, and then made off with all their gold. The other group of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by something. A person, a group of people, an animal, or maybe even some unknown creature. They believed there had been some sort of violent attack, and that's why the two brothers were found in those specific positions that suggested they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother desperately reaching for his gun, and the other appearing to have leaped from his bed before he died. But regardless of which side of the debate you fell on, pretty much everyone at the time who heard the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch of river in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. And so, that section of the river was renamed. From that point forward, it was known only as the Headless Valley. And even though it was clear that there were gold prospects in the Headless Valley and all along the South Nahanni and Flat Rivers, after this story broke, people were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so, for a while, people stayed away from the Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided he wasn't going to let some scary stories about headless men and ghosts and killers on the loose get in the way of him taking gold out of the Nahanni Valley. So, all by himself, Martin made the arduous trek into the valley. He made his way up the Flat River and finally found a spot about 70 miles upstream from where the Headless Valley was. He actually built a one-room cabin for himself because he was planning to stay there through the winter. The plan was that he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so, right after he got there, he set up his sluices and started mining for gold. And apparently, he found a lot of it, because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had struck it rich. His partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he had found, because they planned on going back into the valley with him. So, that summer rolled around. His partners went to the designated meeting spot right outside the valley. But Martin never showed up. His partners waited at the meeting spot for several days, until finally, when he still didn't appear, they decided they had to go in there and see if he was okay. At this point, he should have been there. There was no excuse. And so, they ended up going into the Nahanni Valley themselves. They made their way up the Flat River and went roughly to the area where they knew he was staying, based on the message he had sent earlier describing his location. And they found his cabin. Or, I should say, they found what was left of his cabin. It had been completely torched, burned to the ground. And lying on the ground next to the burned-out structure were the burned-out remains of another headless corpse. This corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police conducted a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what had actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the deaths of the two McLeod brothers. Even though they were all decapitated, they were in roughly the same area, and it had all happened within a few years of each other. The cases looked very, very similar. But even with all of that, the police said, no, these are totally separate incidents. They concluded that Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull was missing. Martin's skull was never located. And the gold that Martin had claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin. It wasn't on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy all over again. And despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, the public didn't see it that way. It was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that had happened close together in a relatively short period of time. And so, a lot of people became convinced that there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in the Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when a gold prospector named John O'Brien and his partner decided that despite the rumors of the so-called killer or whatever was going on, they were going to go into the Nahanni Valley and try their hand at finding gold. And so, the two of them made their way into the valley, and they set up a camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found, decapitated. They set up their camp, and they were there for a couple of days. They were doing well. They were finding gold. And then at some point, John told his partner that he was going to go out and check all of their traps along the river, and that he would be back in about 8 or 9 days. His partner waited. 8 or 9 days passed, and John didn't come back. A couple more days went by, and now John was officially past due. So, his partner decided he had to go out and look for him. There was another gold prospector in the area, so John's partner contacted him, and the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream. They eventually found John. He had frozen to death. But it was the way he was positioned that was so interesting. He was sitting upright in front of a campfire that had obviously been lit previously. He wasn't hunched over. He didn't look like he was in any pain. He just looked like he was enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even still holding a matchbook in his hand. It was as if he was just sitting there, enjoying the warmth of the fire, when something caused him to suddenly freeze solid. In fact, witnesses would later say that John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to the process of freezing to death. The police, when they came out, would say, this is odd. This is a very odd way for him to be positioned. But ultimately, he died because he froze to death. And so, there was no foul play here, and no further investigation was needed. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. That night, they were all sitting around the fire, joking around. At some point, they all decided to go to sleep. The next day, when everyone woke up, Annie was no longer in the camp. There was no sign of where she had gone. So they began by yelling out her name and walking around the immediate vicinity to see if maybe she had just stepped away for a minute. But Annie was just gone. No one knew where she went. The hunting party spent the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there was no sign of her. They ultimately had to leave the valley. They told the police came out, and there was a huge search, but Annie was never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near the Flat River near this hunting party when they were there, but was not part of the hunting party himself and didn't know Annie, he was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell the police what he had seen that night out near the Flat River. So he went to the police, and he explained that on that night, when he knew there was a hunting party nearby, he could hear them, he knew they were over there, he said at some point he went to bed. Then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge. He sat up and looked out across the river. It was totally dark, but there was some moonlight, and he was kind of looking around, wondering what was causing the sound, but he couldn't see anything. And then he heard it again. He could tell it was off to his left. And these weren't huge rocks, they were medium to small-sized rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. He's looking, and all of a sudden he sees, maybe a couple 100 yards away, through some sparse trees, a naked woman, a white naked woman, running on all fours up a mountainside. And as she was running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands were knocking little rocks into the river down below. She was right on the edge of this cliff. And as she was running up this hill, she stopped and she turned, and he got a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face, it looked like she was possessed. There was something terribly wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her. Even though he knew that anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds was doomed, he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something very wrong with this woman. The police took his story down and they said, hey, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description. And so it's universally believed that this woman galloping up a hillside in the middle of the night, naked, was Annie Lafferty. The police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because by the time Charlie was telling them this, she had already been gone for months, and the assumption was that she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decided to try their luck in Headless Valley. A man named Phil Powers. He made his way into the valley, he found a spot off the flat river, and he built a cabin. And then, shortly thereafter, his cabin burned to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was found intact, but the strange thing about his death was that based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof, he should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down. This gave rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire even started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was all just one big, tragic accident. But the vast majority of people who had been following along with all of these strange deaths were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, entered the Headless Valley to try their luck. Shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers' cabin, it had burned to the ground. But William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector, a man named Ernest Savard, entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold. When he did not leave the valley for a planned rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him. They would find him inside of a sleeping bag, lying down, decapitated, right along the flat river inside of the Headless Valley. And so the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident. They said he had starved to death or he died of hypothermia, and then after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, and that's why they couldn't find it. The police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley, and he went missing. A search party went in looking for him. John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near the flat river. Some native tribespeople came into their camp, and they warned them about some strange white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They told the search party that these figures were down near the river, they were out in the forest, they were kind of all around, and that they really needed to be careful. They didn't want the figures to see them. And then the tribespeople just left. The search party was absolutely horrified. They knew about the rumors of this place. They were out here looking for someone who had gone missing in this very place. And all night long, all they heard were distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard on the previous nights. They heard these wailing sounds coming from all around them, as if these things that were out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing in the morning, they got up and they left. The leader of that search party would later say that he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister and that the constant wailing they heard the night before was a sound he would never forget for the rest of his life. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far fewer strange incidents reported inside of the Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far fewer people have been going into the Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park. But other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley. And the truth is, nobody knows why. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think really happened in the Nahanni Valley down in the comments below. Was there a killer hiding somewhere deep in those forests? Were these just a series of tragic accidents? Or is there really something out there that people still don't understand? Until next time. It was a bright and clear Friday morning on July 7th, 1967, in Long Island, New York. A 17-year-old girl named Nancy Mashwan was driving along a highway in Brooklyn, New York. She was on her way to her job as a secretary at her dad's office in Brooklyn, and she was coming from her home in Long Island. Now, the commute to her office took about an hour, but Nancy didn't mind because her dad had just got her this beautiful brand new yellow Camaro, and she loved driving it. And the highway she was on had this amazing view of the beach and ocean down below. And so that day, Nancy rolled down her window so she could feel the ocean breeze as she drove. And then she took in a deep breath, and she smiled. At the same time Nancy was doing this, a police lieutenant was driving in his car a couple cars back from Nancy. And as he was just driving along, he suddenly sees this yellow Camaro that to this point had been driving completely normally, suddenly veer off the road, miraculously missed the oncoming cars, and then smashed into a tree on the side of the road. And so the police lieutenant instinctively jammed on his brakes and veered over to the shoulder and stopped behind the Camaro. As the lieutenant got out of the car, he was thinking clearly the driver must have just had some kind of medical emergency because he didn't see any obstacles in the road. And, the Camaro had been driving completely normally to that point. So, what would cause them to veer and crash into the road at such a high speed other than a medical emergency? And so the lieutenant jumps out of the car, runs over to the driver's side window, and he looks inside and he sees this teenage girl, this blonde teenage girl, and she is slumped over the wheel. And she is not looking up at him. She is not making any sound. She is just sitting there. And so he opens up the door and he asks her, "Are you okay?" And she didn't say anything, but she did moan. And so she was breathing, she was alive, and there weren't any obvious physical injuries. Clearly she has just crashed into this tree at high speed. So she is definitely shaken up, but there weren't any obvious grievous injuries that have occurred here. At least none that he could see. And so he asked her again, "Hey, are you okay? What is going on here?" And she just continued to moan. And so, again, considering he is looking at her and she seems, basically okay, all things considered, he thought, maybe she is drunk. I mean, that would kind of explain, the sudden veering off the road. And so at this point, the lieutenant radioed for backup and also called for an ambulance. And while he waited, he began searching the car, just basically looking to see if maybe there was some clue in the car as to what happened here, for example, containers of alcohol. And so he is looking around and he doesn't see any empty bottles. And he can't smell any alcohol in the car. But still, this whole time, the girl is not responding. She is just moaning and just kind of slumped over there. And then a couple of minutes later, he hears sirens and he looks up and a bunch of first responders came over. They pulled the girl out of the car, got her in the ambulance, and off to the hospital she went. Once Nancy got to the hospital, medical staff was able to determine that she was not drunk, but she did clearly appear to be having some kind of medical emergency, but they didn't know what it was. And again, there was no visible injuries on her. I mean, she just basically looked really shaken up and was non-responsive. And quickly after Nancy was at the hospital, her condition only got worse, to the point where doctors were giving her shots of adrenaline to try to keep her alive, but it didn't work. And at 11:30 a.m., roughly 2.5 hours after Nancy crashed into the tree, she died. And it was only then, after Nancy was dead, that the medical staff made a discovery. Something they had totally missed when Nancy had first came in. And that was on the back of her head, hidden amongst her hair, was a small circular hole. It was a bullet wound. And for some reason, it didn't bleed at all. Clearly, Nancy did not just randomly veer off the road and smash into a tree. No, she had been shot. About 30 minutes after this discovery was made, a detective named Albert Seidman was standing next to Nancy's crashed car on the side of the highway. Seidman had a reputation as being this totally no-nonsense detective who effectively would stop at nothing to try to solve a case. By this point, he had already spoken to Nancy's parents, who obviously were devastated and very confused by their daughter's death. They said that, Nancy never got in trouble and certainly didn't have any enemies. And so it made no sense that somebody had just shot her as she was driving. And Detective Seidman had to agree this was not an average murder case. But regardless, he knew the best place to start this investigation was Nancy's car. The car was actually in pretty good shape. I mean, despite striking this tree at high speeds, the body of the car basically remained intact. And so Seidman began going inside the car and looking all around it, looking for bullet holes to see where this bullet came in and struck the driver. But he found none. Really, there was nothing in the car that gave any information away about what actually happened here. Also, adding to the mystery here is Seidman knew there had been that police lieutenant who just happened to be driving a few cars back from Nancy when she suddenly veered off the road and crashed. And he would say that he did not hear any gunshots. Although admittedly, he wasn't really listening for gunshots, but he said everything was normal and then the car just veered and crashed. He couldn't understand it. Detective Seidman had briefly considered that, maybe Nancy had been shot by somebody inside of her car, but because of the presence of that lieutenant who immediately was on the scene and was basically looking at the car from the time it crashed all the way until the ambulance arrived, he said there was nobody else in the car and I did not witness anybody fleeing the scene. The whole situation was very bizarre. But Detective Seidman, thinking logically, thought, okay, well, we know she has been shot. So even though nobody knows how that happened, well, there has to be a shell casing somewhere for the round that struck her. And so, for the rest of the day, Seidman and his team canvassed that whole highway all around that area, looking for a shell casing or really any clue that a gun had been fired in the vicinity, but they found nothing. By the end of the day, Detective Seidman was beginning to feel pretty disappointed about how the investigation was going so far. But he thought to himself, okay, well, I know I haven't found anything promising yet, but remember, she was shot not in some secluded area. She was shot on a major highway in Brooklyn, New York, a city of over 2.5 million people. I mean, someone somewhere must have seen or heard something. And so, instead of continuing to look for a shell casing, Seidman abandoned that idea and decided to go find witnesses. Over the next 5 days, Detective Seidman and his team scoured Brooklyn and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people looking for anybody who had any information about this shooting. They also put out a public plea for information and were fielding tips that way. But at the end of those 5 days, despite the huge number of interviews, they really hadn't gotten anywhere. As Seidman began to feel his frustration rising, because once again, it just felt like they were hitting another dead end on this case, he told himself they must have missed something. They had talked to a ton of people, but maybe they were too quick. Maybe they weren't asking the right questions. And so on July 12th, he gathered up his team and he circled some spots on a map of Brooklyn and said, look guys, we are going to go back to these key areas that are sort of positioned in the best angles to have maybe heard or seen something with this shooting. And we are going to ask some more questions and just see if maybe these people have something we didn't catch. In one of those circled areas, the police discovered a gas station that was owned by a guy named Theodore Day, and it was located only 2 blocks away from where Nancy had been shot. And on the morning of July 12th, when the police officers rolled up to this gas station, Theodore was working and he saw the police coming towards him, and right away he knew this had to be about Nancy Michon. So Theodore had been following this case really closely as it was developing for 2 reasons. One, Nancy had been shot really close to his gas station, so there is that proximity bias. And 2, Theodore was actually friends with Nancy's father and had known Nancy growing up. And so this case really hit close to home. When the police walked inside the gas station, Theodore immediately asked them, "Are you here about Nancy?" And they would say yes. And that's when he would tell them his connection to Nancy and how he was following this case really closely. But despite his proximity to where she had been shot, he said unfortunately he hadn't seen or heard anything. But then Theodore quickly followed that up and said that, well, while he had been at the gas station in the morning for a little bit, he did take off at some point to go fishing out on the water in his boat, which was not too far away. But even from there, too, he still said he didn't hear or see anything, but it was kind of noisy out on the water anyways. So, he really wouldn't have heard anything out there anyhow. The police nodded and asked some simple follow-up questions to Theodore about, take us through what happened that morning. What did you see? Were there other fishermen out there? When you were at the gas station, did you see anything unusual? Just kind of seeing if there was anything that would jog his memory. And Theodore was answering every question as truthfully as he could. And at some point, he began to think really hard about what he actually saw when he was out on the water fishing. And suddenly, it all clicked. Theodore knew who killed Nancy. It would turn out at 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, the exact moment Nancy was shot, veered off the road, and crashed. Theodore was in fact out in his boat fishing. Except at 8:40 a.m., he wasn't actually fishing. Instead, he had a can, and he threw that can into the water. And once he saw the can, he kind of kept staring at it. And then he raised his rifle, and he fired a shot at the can, but he missed. And the bullet, by some fluke of physics, ricocheted off the surface of the water, went up into the highway right as Nancy had rolled her window down, struck her in the head, and killed her. Theodore knew he had been shooting his gun out on the water, but what he saw was the bullet hit the water. He didn't think for a second he could have fired up towards the highway. It was when police began asking questions that he thought, oh my goodness, it is possible a ricochet could have struck her in the head. Theodore was charged with homicide, but ultimately a grand jury chose not to indict him, citing that this truly was an accident. Theodore did not serve any jail time, but he was fined $100 for firing a rifle within city limits. It was a tragic end to a young life, caused by an unbelievable stroke of terrible luck on a warm summer morning. Fast forward to another cold and shocking case, this one occurring decades later in the state of Texas. On the evening of September 17, 2021, a 42-year-old preacher named Jason Thornburg was cleaning up his motel room in Euless, Texas, which is a small city between Dallas and Fort Worth. Jason was going to be hosting a small Bible study group in his motel room in a few minutes. And even though really it was not that dirty, he was really taking time to ensure it was as clean and inviting as he could possibly make it. So normally, Jason would host these Bible study groups at his house, but unfortunately, Jason's house burned down just that past summer, and he lost everything. But Jason was so committed to God and spreading the word of God that he still wanted to continue having these Bible study groups, even if it meant, doing it in this kind of crummy motel room. And so Jason walked around the room, picking up laundry and straightening up his bed. And then after kind of arranging chairs in a circle for the various participants he was expecting, he went over to a cabinet, pulled out some Bibles, and right as he was about to start placing these Bibles on each chair, he heard a knock at the door. And Jason was really excited because he knew that had to be someone who was here for this Bible study. And so he walked right over, Bibles in hand, to the door. He opened it up, and standing outside the door was this big guy covered in tattoos, kind of looking down at Jason. And Jason broke into a big smile. He was so happy to see this guy. The man's name was David Lewis, and Jason had previously met him when he was out on the street doing outreach for his church, and he had invited David to, anytime he wanted to come by the motel and be a part of this Bible study group. Now, Jason knew that David was really not the kind of guy who went to church or really showed any real interest in God or, the Bible. But, Jason took all kinds, and he was just hopeful that maybe David would show up someday. And now, here David was. However, David told Jason that the reason he was here was actually not for the Bible study group. He was here because he was in the middle of a crisis, and he didn't know where else to turn. He confessed to Jason that he had begun using drugs and gotten mixed up in some criminal activity, and, there is some dangerous people out there that he was sort of running with, and now his concern was some of those dangerous people were coming to get him, and so he literally felt like his life was in danger. Now, when Jason heard this, he was surprised, but at the same time, he could tell that David was being very authentic and just needed help. And Jason felt like, his job ultimately was to serve God and all of God's people. And David was one of those people, and he was in need of help. And so if all Jason did was simply provide a safe haven for David inside of this motel room, then that was serving God, and it was the right thing to do. And so Jason immediately said, "No problem, David." He handed him a Bible and said, "Come on in." David took the Bible awkwardly and just kind of stood there for a moment, not really sure what to do. But then Jason said, "Hey, relax. Just come inside. Take a seat." And so David did. He walked in. He sat down with the Bible. And then Jason actually came over and sat down next to him, and the two of them, for about 15 minutes, just made kind of awkward small talk. Jason could tell, David is completely on edge. He was staring at the door, which was now closed, and he just clearly was very anxious and paranoid. And so Jason really wasn't talking about the Bible or God or anything. He was just, trying to calm David down and show him that this was a safe place. And then after about 15 minutes of this, when David had somewhat calmed down, and also by this point, nobody else had showed up for this Bible study group, Jason decided, okay, you know what? Maybe I'll just begin the Bible study with David. It kind of gives us something to do. And so Jason got up. He locked the door, showing David that it's just going to be them. It's safe here. And he told David to go ahead and open his Bible to a certain page. And then the two of them just began reading the Bible together. And for hours, they just sat there reading the Bible. And Jason spoke to David about, teachings of God and how to lead your life in a way to serve other people. And, for the most part, David did completely calm down and seemed to really be embracing this Bible study. But eventually, despite how well this Bible study was going, it did need to come to an end at some point, at least in Jason's mind. And when he began to notice it was getting dark outside, he sort of began wrapping it up, and he shut his Bible and sort of expected that David would take a hint and leave. But David didn't. Instead, when David began to realize that, hey, this is over now and it's time for you to go, David looked at Jason and begged him to please let him stay in this room overnight, that he can't go out there. It's not safe for him. Now, Jason knew he did have some level of responsibility for David. David had told him he was in danger. He had already invited him inside and was basically providing safe haven for him. And it did feel kind of wrong to be like, now go back out there. But at the same time, Jason felt a little uneasy. He didn't really know David. He didn't really understand the situation. And so there was some hesitation at first, but after looking again at David and seeing how desperate he was to just please stay here overnight, Jason said, "Okay, you can stay." So Jason grabbed some extra blankets and pillows and created a makeshift bed on the floor. And then after that, the two of them actually reopened their Bibles and just began reading some more from the Bible for a couple more hours. It was basically another round of Bible study. But eventually, they both were very tired. So they put their Bibles down. They said goodnight. They each climbed into their beds, and they closed their eyes and fell asleep. For the next 5 days, Jason's motel room remained mostly closed. And the only thing anybody heard coming from his room was gospel music. And it was being played at a very high volume basically the entire time, to the point where other residents of this motel began to complain about how loud the music was. However, the owner of the motel was getting these complaints from residents who were only there for, hours at a time or days at a time. And, the room they're complaining about, Jason's room, he was a long-term resident and so had a sort of higher priority with the owner. And so the owner just didn't feel like bothering Jason. He wanted him to stay and keep paying for that room. And so the owner didn't do anything about the noise complaints. And also, the owner did know that his motel had sort of a seedy reputation. And so, generally speaking, he didn't really care too much about the music to begin with. And so over the course of these 5 days, the music kept on blasting. And really the only other thing of note, again, that happened in this period of time was that these 2 other people entered Jason's motel room and didn't leave either. So basically, there is 4 people in the room. They haven't come out again. Super loud music. That's all going on for 5 days. And then on the 5th day, the morning of September 22nd, a single person walked out of Jason's motel room, and they were wearing a full-body hazmat suit and carrying some sort of luggage, and they would leave the motel, get in a car, and drive away. 45 minutes later, about 25 miles away from that motel, the Fort Worth Fire Department got a call about this raging dumpster fire in a residential neighborhood. Firefighters quickly got to the scene and put out the blaze. And after it was gone, they walked up to the smoky dumpster and looked inside just to get a look at what was burning. And what they saw caused them all to back up and call the police. It would turn out David was right when he said he was in danger. However, what he didn't understand is hiding out in Jason's motel room was not going to protect him from that danger. Shortly after, he and Jason wrapped up that second Bible study that night, and the 2 of them climbed into their respective beds. Jason in his actual bed, and David in the makeshift bed on the floor. Well, David did fall asleep pretty quickly, but Jason didn't. Jason waited until David was asleep. And then Jason got up, got a knife, and then slit David's throat. Then he cut David's heart out and ate it because Jason, the preacher, really actually believed that human sacrifice was the best and purest way to serve God. Over the course of the next 5 days after killing David, Jason would remain in his motel room blasting gospel music. And over those 5 days, he would basically lure those 2 women into his room, very likely on the promise of Bible study. But they too would be sacrificed. And then on the 5th day, the person who exited the motel room in the full hazmat suit was Jason. And that luggage he was carrying with him contained the body parts of the 3 people he had just killed. And he brought those body parts to that dumpster in that residential neighborhood and lit them on fire. And so when the firefighters put out the fire, what they saw inside were burned up bodies. Jason was arrested, and while he was awaiting trial, he confessed that David and the 2 women were not actually his first victims. He said that just a few years earlier, he had sacrificed his girlfriend, and that house fire that destroyed all of his belongings and prompted him to go live in this motel was set by Jason himself because he had sacrificed his roommate and needed to get rid of the evidence. Ultimately, law enforcement was only able to show that Jason killed those 5 people. But there could have been more. Jason was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Texas awaiting his final execution, leaving behind a dark, disturbing legacy that the small community will never forget. At this point, we must turn our attention halfway around the globe to the massive high-rise metropolis of Hong Kong, where we uncover a final tale of calculated murder and a scheme that ended in the ultimate tragic mistake. On the evening of Thursday, May 21st, 2015, a 16-year-old girl named Lily walked into the home gym inside of her house in Hong Kong looking to do a workout. Now, she sort of expected the gym would be empty and she could kind of have the run of the place, but as soon as she walked in, she saw her dad was in there and he was doing some sort of cool-down exercise on a yoga ball. So Lily's dad, whose name was Ka Kim Sun, was a doctor and a professional. and normally at this time of the day, she would never see him in the gym. He was typically locked upstairs in his study or, upstairs doing work or something, or he was just gone for the day. So for him to be here, it just didn't really line up with his schedule. And so Lily asked her dad, what are you doing here? What is going on? And her dad would tell her, well, actually, work at the hospital was really slow today, so I took off. I played some tennis with friends, and now I'm just doing some cool down exercises because I got nothing else to do, but I'll be out of your hair in a second. And sure enough, a couple minutes later, her dad was up and out of the gym, and Lily just began her workout. The next day, May 22nd, around 1 o'clock, Lily was at home at her dining room table, sitting across from her mother, whose name was Wong Su Fing, and Lily was eating a snack and staring at an open textbook. Normally, at 1 o'clock on a Friday, Lily would be at school, but she had had the day off that day. And she had wanted to spend her day off seeing friends and just being a teenager, but her dad was really focused on her being successful academically. And he told her that absolutely not. You are not going anywhere. You are going to stay home, and you are going to study all day long. You will not leave the house. That is what you are doing. So Lily just continued to stare at the textbook and basically do what her father said. And then a couple of minutes later, she actually heard her dad coming down the stairs, and he came into the dining room, and he was clearly very pleased to see his daughter doing her work, or at least appearing to do her work. And he came over to her, gave her a kiss. He kissed their mother, and then he said he was off to work. And then he went out the door, and he was gone. And as soon as Ka was gone, Lily's mom looked over at her and said, I'm not going to make you study all day. Come on, let's go out and have a mother-daughter shopping day. And Lily was stoked. She shut her textbook. She went and got ready. And then a minute later, she and her mom climbed into her mom's yellow Mini Cooper car, and they headed out. About 2 hours later, around 4:15 p.m., a local jogger was running in the same neighborhood as where Lily and her family lived. And as they were running down the road, they noticed there was this yellow Mini Cooper car sitting on the side of the road, not moving, but it was still on. It was just sort of idling right there. And at first glance, it appeared there were people inside the car, but they weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there, not moving. And so the jogger was curious. And so they ran past and made a point to look inside the car. And they saw two women in the front two seats of this car slumped over. Pie-eye. The two women were Lily and her mother. And so the jogger began to panic and banged on the glass to try to get the women to respond, but they didn't. And so a minute later, police were called. They dragged Lily and her mother out of the car. They were totally unresponsive. They were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. They both died. The police would begin their investigation into their deaths by searching the yellow Mini Cooper car. And when they searched it, there really was nothing of note inside of it. I mean, the two women's purses were in the front of the car. There was some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, but the car was pristine, clean, not cluttered. I mean, there really was nothing in the car that gave away what could have happened to these two women. For the next 6 months, the police tirelessly looked for some lead as to what happened to this mother and daughter. They would interview all their friends and family. They would search their house top to bottom. They would basically take apart this Mini Cooper and look for, defects or flaws that maybe could have contributed to their death. I mean, they were looking everywhere, but it just didn't make sense. Nobody had any idea what happened to these two women. And so right as this case appeared like it was about to go cold, the detectives decided to just go back to the Mini Cooper and see if maybe, just maybe, they missed something. And sure enough, they had. It would turn out on May 22nd, 2015, the day that Lily and her mother died, Lily's father had told Lily to stay home and study, not because he cared about her academics. I mean, he did, but that day, the reason for this was not for that. Instead, he wanted her to stay home all day to protect her. When police originally searched Lily's mom's car, they found the two women's purses and also some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, specifically a deflated yoga ball. And at the time, the police didn't think anything of these items. They looked into them, They considered them, but they didn't seem to have any bearing on what happened to the women. However, it would turn out the yoga ball did have something to do with it. Specifically, 2 days before the women were found dead, that yoga ball was inside of Lily's home. It was in her home gym. In fact, when she walked into the home gym and saw her dad doing cool-down exercises and thought it was strange he was home right now, he was using that yoga ball. And Lily didn't think anything of it. But in reality, what her father was doing was not cool-down exercises. He had not just come home early and, had played tennis and this and that. In reality, he had taken that yoga ball to the hospital where he worked and filled it with carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless, poisonous gas. And his plan was to put the yoga ball in his wife's car, unplug it, and now it is sealed, and the gas is going to leak inside the car. And then when his wife got in the car and shut the door, she would effectively suffocate and die. He didn't try to kill his daughter, though. He wanted her to stay home and study, that is, don't go with your mom and get in the car. But the mother defied the father, brought the daughter along, and then after driving for only a mile, the two women collapsed and died from the lethal dose of carbon monoxide that had completely filled the small passenger compartment of the Mini Cooper. Ka Kim's son was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He has never explained his motive, leaving his surviving family members with endless questions and a deep, permanent sense of sorrow. These cases, though separated by decades and geography, remind us of the terrifying, unpredictable nature of crime. In Nancy Mashuen's case, an innocent drive turned fatal due to a reckless choice on the water blocks away. For David Lewis, a desperate plea for shelter led him straight into the hands of a cold-blooded killer posing as a man of faith. And for Lily, a mother's loving decision to bypass a strict father's rules ended in an accidental tragedy caused by that very father's deadly and calculated plot. It leaves us to reflect on how quickly a normal day can transform into a tragedy and how the actions of others can alter our lives forever. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In the early 2000s, a teenager named Evan and his father had a shared passion. It was hunting. But more than that, it was just being out in the woods together, away from everything. They spent countless weekends in the Georgia backcountry, and it was their thing. When Evan turned 14, something really special happened. His father had become friends with a very wealthy man, a landowner in Georgia who owned a massive, pristine piece of property. And this man offered them something incredible, exclusive access to one of his best private hunting areas. Just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Evan and his dad decided to take him up on the offer. They woke up before the sun, the air still cool and damp. The truck was already packed. They drove for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the rural parts of the state until they finally reached the edge of the property. It was completely fenced in, just as the owner had said. They pulled up to a big, sturdy main gate. Evan's dad pulled a slip of paper from his pocket with the combination code the owner had given them. He punched in the numbers, and with a heavy click, the lock released. They swung the gate open, drove the truck through, and then got out to shut and lock it behind them. The sound of the gate locking echoed a little. It was a strange feeling being locked inside this huge expanse of land. But it also felt secure, like they had the whole world to themselves. They got back in the truck and started down a long, winding access road. They followed this dirt path for about 2 miles, kicking up dust behind them. The road finally came to a stop at the edge of a huge, dense forest. This was it. They parked the truck, killed the engine, and the world went completely silent. They got out, stretched their legs, and started putting on their gear. In the pre-morning darkness, with only the faint light of dawn filtering through the trees, they began their hike into the woods. Now, even though they were there to hunt, Evan and his father secretly loved just hiking and camping. They'd take any chance they could to extend their trips, even if the hunting wasn't great. They were comfortable in the woods. They knew its sounds, its rhythms, its life. And so, almost as soon as they stepped under the canopy of trees in this particular forest, they both noticed something was very, very wrong. There were no birds chirping. There were no squirrels chattering or rustling in the leaves. There were no animals at all. It was just silent. A deep, unnatural silence. The only sound they heard that wasn't made by their own footsteps was the distant hum of a single airplane passing high overhead. They stopped for a moment and just listened. Nothing. Evan looked at his dad, who just shrugged. They found it incredibly odd, but they tried to reason it away. You know, this is private property, they thought. Not a lot of people are ever out here. The animals probably heard the truck or heard us talking and just scattered. It made sense, sort of. They eventually made it to the hunting stand the owner had told them about. It was a good setup, high in a tree with a clear view of a small clearing. They got all settled in, got their rifles ready, and they waited. And waited. All day long, they didn't see a single deer, a single rabbit, not even a bird. They didn't hear anything either. The silence that had felt strange in the morning now felt heavy, almost oppressive, by the afternoon. Frustrated, they finally decided to call it a day. They began packing up their gear, making their way carefully down the ladder of the stand. They started looking around for a good place to make camp for the night. Evan's father had an idea. He turned to Evan and said, "Hey, there's obviously nothing happening over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods for a while? We can set up camp there, and then tomorrow we'll have a better chance of seeing some animals." It sounded like a good plan, so they started hiking. They walked for about an hour, pushing farther and farther away from their truck and the hunting stand. They eventually reached a small clearing that looked perfect for a campsite. So they dropped their packs and got to work. They set up their tent, a small dome tent they had used 1,000 times. Evan knew exactly how to do it. He slid the 2 flexible poles through the nylon loops, crossed them over the top, and then bent them to anchor each of the 4 ends into the little metal eyelets at the base of the tent. The tension is what held the whole thing up. With the tent set up and their gear stored inside, they realized they still had some daylight left. Evan's father looked at him and said, "You want to go try our luck one more time? See if we can spot anything out here?" Evan figured, why not? So they hiked a little ways away from their new campsite and set up a small hunting blind. And once again, they saw absolutely nothing. It was just as quiet and still as it had been all day. Defeated, they packed up the blind and started heading back to their tent. As they got closer, they could see their campsite through the trees. And right away, they saw something was wrong. Their tent, which they had just set up an hour ago, was now completely collapsed. Evan's father turned to him and said, "Oh, it must have been the wind." But Evan immediately shook his head. "No," he said, "it couldn't have been the wind. We've been talking all day about how quiet it is. There's been no wind, no weather at all. That's what's making the silence so creepy. It definitely wasn't the wind." So Evan's father looked at him, a little annoyed. "Well," he asked, "when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly?" Evan felt a flash of frustration. "No," he said, "I've set that tent up 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly. We both saw it. We put our gear inside." They walked into their campsite and looked down at the flattened tent, and they were really confused by what they saw. The 2 long rods that cross over the top of the tent had been removed from the 4 corner anchor points. Now, if you know how these tents work, they're held up by tension. Once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. You have to physically bend the rod and pull it out of the anchor. It's actually a little difficult to do. Basically, for the tent to collapse like this, either the rods would have had to break, or someone would have had to come over and manually, deliberately pull all 4 ends of the rods out of their anchors, and they knew they didn't do it. And none of the rods were broken. This left them with 2 possibilities. Either they had both somehow failed to set up their tent correctly, even though they had clear memories of doing it and double-checking it because they put their sleeping bags and packs inside, or someone had come to their campsite while they were gone and collapsed their tent. They decided, you know what, it can't be some stranger. We're the only ones with the gate combination. This is private property. No one could have been here. And why would they do that? If someone did find our campsite, why would they just randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? It had to be us. We must have not set it up right. And even though they didn't really believe that, they convinced themselves that's what must have happened. Because the alternative was just too bizarre, and frankly, too terrifying to consider. So they built their tent again, making sure the rods were securely in place this time. They made a small fire and sat for a little while, chatting quietly as the sun went down. But they were both tired, and the strange day had worn them out. They decided to just go to bed. They carefully extinguished the fire, got into the tent, and both fell asleep. A couple of hours later, Evan woke up suddenly. He wasn't sure if he was dreaming or not, but he thought he heard someone laughing. It sounded like it was a couple 100 meters away, behind their tent, off in the woods. Evan instinctively turned to make sure his dad was still in the tent with him, and he was, sleeping soundly. Evan held his breath and started listening really intently to what was happening outside. And all he could hear was that same deep silence that had been there all day. He didn't hear any more laughter. He thought, okay, I must have just been dreaming. There wasn't any laughter out there. And eventually, Evan managed to fall back asleep. A little while later, Evan woke up suddenly again. Except this time, his dad was already awake, sitting up and looking around anxiously in the dark. Evan sat up and whispered, "What's going on?" And his dad just held up a hand and said, "Shh." Then he whispered, "Can you hear that?" Evan listened, and to his absolute horror, he heard it too. Laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Evan also realized the laughter wasn't coming from the same area he'd heard it the first time. It was now coming from the opposite direction, and it was a lot closer to them. Evan very quietly and carefully explained to his dad that he'd actually heard this same laughter a couple of hours earlier, but had thought it was a dream. Evan's father turned to him in the darkness, and his voice was tense. He said, "Before we came out here, I asked the owner specifically, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property, and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys." After this revelation, a cold dread settled over them. They both turned their attention back to just listening. They were hoping this was just going to stop, that whatever this was, it was just going to leave. But it didn't leave. Suddenly, they heard footsteps. They were running towards them from way off in the forest. It was so quiet out that it was really easy to hear the footsteps, the snapping of twigs, the pounding on the hard earth. And whatever this was, it was charging directly towards them. And then it came to a complete, sudden stop, right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Evan was grabbing onto his father's arm. Evan's father was holding his rifle, getting ready to open the tent and confront whatever was out there. And right before he grabbed the zipper, this person, whatever it was, started laughing again. And it was practically right on top of them. It was so loud they could hear it clear as day, right there, just outside their tent. Evan's father took a deep breath. He grabbed the zipper of the tent door, and as soon as he began to move it, the small zipping sound it made caused the laughter to instantly stop. Dead silence. They didn't hear footsteps running away, so they knew something was probably still out there. But the laughter just cut off, as if it had recognized that they were making noise, that they were right there in the tent. Evan's father froze with his hand on the zipper. He was debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he could even make that decision, whatever this thing was, it turned around and ran back into the woods. They could hear the footsteps fading into the distance until it was just gone. And for several minutes, they just sat like that in total silence, praying that whatever this was, it was gone for good. After several long minutes, when they didn't hear anything else, no more laughing, no more running, Evan's father re-zipped the tent and put his hand back down. They were both left just sitting there in the dark thinking, what in the world just happened? Evan and his father would stay awake all night. They barely spoke to each other. Whatever this thing was, it had heard them when they moved the zipper. So they were really afraid of making any sound at all, even little sounds, because it was so quiet that sound traveled really far. And they didn't know who or what was out there. So in silence, holding their guns, they just waited for the sun to come up. And as soon as the first light of dawn appeared, they were up and out of there. They didn't even pack the tent properly, they just stuffed it into a bag. They were practically running out of the forest, checking over their shoulders the whole time, all the way back to their truck. To this day, they have no idea who or what was running around out there. They told the owner of the property about it, and the owner just said it's not possible. He told them, "We have a totally gated-in, private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. You are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor the property. Nobody else was in there." In the summer of 2013, a young woman named Katie and her father decided to go camping at one of their favorite campgrounds high up in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Katie loved going camping with her father. He was this totally accomplished outdoorsman. He used to be a wilderness guide for much of his life, so she just always felt like she was in great hands whenever she was out in the wild with him. And because of him, she had become a fairly accomplished outdoorswoman herself. When they arrived at the campground, the parking lot was packed with cars. They looked at each other and thought, shoot, I wish we'd called ahead a couple of weeks ago to reserve a site. They're probably not even available now. But they went to the front desk at the ranger station, and the ranger told them they were in luck. He said they had one site available, but it was the one that was way over on the far end of the campground. It was this one specific campsite that was kind of isolated from all the rest. It was a long walk from the main bathhouse, it was far away from the lake where you'd go swimming, and it was a good distance from the parking lot. It was just really inconvenient. Whenever they came camping here in the past, it was the one site they always hoped they wouldn't get. But beggars can't be choosers. They were just happy to have a site at all, so they took it. They drove all the way down this little dirt road to this very isolated campsite tucked away in the middle of the forest. Once they got there, they began setting up their respective tents. They weren't going to be staying in the same one. They each had these very small one-person backpacking tents. They were so small that you had a choice to make. You could either zip it up all the way to stay warmer and more protected from bugs, but you had to sleep curled up in a ball because your legs wouldn't fit otherwise. Or you could unzip the front flap of your tent, and when you lay down, you could extend your legs fully, but your legs would be protruding outside of your tent. You could only really do that in warmer weather, and if you were comfortable having your legs poking out into the wilderness. After they got their tent set up, they got their coolers situated, and they had all their stuff kind of the way they wanted it, they went out hiking for the rest of the day. When they came back that evening, they were totally exhausted. They ate a quick dinner, got into their tents, and fell asleep pretty much immediately. Nothing of note happened over that first night. The next day, they got up, had breakfast, and went back out hiking all day all over again. They came back that night, and they were completely exhausted once more. They got into their tents and went to bed. And this night, something of note would definitely happen. At about 3 a.m, Katie woke up. She heard footsteps walking towards the campsite from a little ways off. They were in the woods somewhere. Her first thought was, okay, it's got to be my father. He's diabetic, and every night he gets up to go to the bathroom maybe 3 or 4 times. He was probably just walking to the bathhouse, and now he's walking back. But then she realized something. The bathhouse was over in one direction, but the footsteps were coming from the complete opposite direction. What was he doing walking towards the campsite from that side of the woods? The footsteps came out of the tree line. They crunched on the dirt as they came into the clearing that was their campsite. And then they stopped about 2 or 3 meters outside of Katie's tent. Now, there were no windows on Katie's little backpacking tent. There were just small vents at the front and the back that kind of pointed down so she couldn't see out. And there was no moon that night, so there was no illumination. You couldn't even pick up a silhouette. It was just total darkness out there. She couldn't see who was there, she could only hear them. But she was still thinking, okay, maybe my dad got lost coming back from the bathhouse because he didn't have a flashlight and he walked too far. That's possible. Or, he could have decided to relieve himself just in the tree line, even though he's not known to do that. He's a guy that always goes to the bathhouse. So she's running through all these scenarios in her head that are convincing her that, oh, that's just my dad. But what she really wanted to hear, what would confirm it for her, was that person walking away from her tent and getting into her father's tent. That would prove it was him. So she's sitting there in the dark, waiting for that confirmation. And then she hears the footsteps again. But instead of walking around her tent towards her father's tent, this person walked right up against her tent very quickly. And they clearly began leaning over her little tiny tent because she could hear them breathing right above her. And this is the moment when she realized with a jolt of ice-cold fear, that's not my dad. And as she's having this terrible revelation that some stranger is outside her tent right now, she has an even worse one. It was a warm night that night. So she was sleeping with her tent unzipped and her legs poking out the end. She mustered all her courage and began to slowly, carefully retract her legs back inside her tent. But before she was able to get them all the way in, this person stood up, turned, and started walking towards the base of her tent, right where her legs were. She was completely frozen, terrified about what was about to happen. But this person didn't stop at her feet. They kept moving and, in fact, started circling her tent. But because they were making a lot of noise walking around her, it allowed her to pull her legs back into her tent without them hearing her. So she had this small illusion of safety being fully inside her tent. But her tent was still unzipped at the bottom. She was waiting for this person to come around, crouch down, and look inside, because it was open. And so she's just looking down at the opening, hoping that doesn't happen. But unfortunately, right at this moment, the person walked to the base of her tent and came to a stop, right outside where the opening was. And so she's sitting there, thinking, please don't come in here, please don't come in here, please don't come in here. And even though her feet were pulled up inside her tent now, she suddenly felt something pinch her foot. And she knew it was a hand. Something had reached in and grabbed her foot. She stifled a scream, clamping her hand over her mouth. She started shaking uncontrollably because her instincts were screaming at her, don't let this person know you're awake. And luckily, as she was sitting there, shaking from fear and trying to be as quiet as she possibly could, this person stood back up again. They went back to the spot next to her tent and leaned over it once again. And she could hear them breathing right over her. And so for several minutes, she lay there, shaking, with this random person who had just pinched her foot hovering over her tent in the middle of the night. And she had nothing she could do. She just stayed quiet, hoping it was going to end soon. Eventually, this person would turn around and walk over to their cooler and their picnic table and some other things that were out. She heard some rummaging going on. Some things were being moved around. And then this person just kind of walked off into the distance. But she didn't know if they were really gone. She didn't know if they were standing at the edge of the tree line, just waiting for her to come outside. Maybe they had laid a trap for her. And so she just lay there, silent, not moving a muscle. And she's praying to herself, please don't let anything happen to me or my father. And all night, she's just laying there. Eventually, probably hours later, she did fall asleep from sheer exhaustion. She woke up again when she heard her father unzipping his tent in the morning. She charged out to meet him, and she could tell right away that he was scared too. And before she could even say anything or begin to describe what happened to her, he said, were you outside your tent last night? At about 2 or 3 in the morning, because I heard all sorts of commotion near our cooler. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or if it was you. And she starts telling him, no, this is what happened to me. And as she's describing what happened to her, he looks behind her at the picnic table, which was next to their cooler. They had their backpacks on it. Basically anything that didn't fit in their tents, they kept near this picnic table. He points at it, and she turns around. and any item that was in the cooler or in their backpacks or that was just out on the table has been stacked in a perfect pyramid formation on the table. Clearly, the person who was there last night did this. For some reason, they couldn't understand, and as they went over to look at it to see if anything had been taken, they noticed a clear track of footprints in the dirt. Heavy footprints that had been going around and around Katie's tent. So she clearly wasn't imagining it. And in that instant, they packed everything up, threw it in their car, and they left. To this day, they can barely talk about it with each other. It's all the things that could have happened. The father felt horribly guilty because he clearly heard this person but didn't leave his tent, and his daughter was clearly in danger. And his daughter keeps thinking the tent was open. This person was crouched down, reaching into my tent, grabbing my feet. It's such a horrifying image. And so this has been completely traumatizing for them, and they just don't talk about it anymore. From the 1950s until the present, a Canadian family has owned this very isolated cabin in the middle of the Ontario backcountry. It was the only property on this very small lake. There were 2 other cabins across the lake, but they were pretty far away. And with the exception of the side of the cabin that was facing the water, the rest of it was surrounded by really dense forest that went on for miles and miles. About 2 miles away from this cabin, on the other side of a dirt road, was this huge wildlife reserve. It was pretty much just a massive, protected forest. And anytime the family was visiting this cabin, the kids would at some point go into the reserve and go exploring. In 2001, when the family was at the cabin, the kids were across the road over at the reserve. And they decided to walk down this particular trail that they hadn't seen before. They just started walking, and for about 30 minutes, they were seeing new areas they hadn't seen before. And then they came to a clearing. And in the clearing were all these abandoned houses. At first, there was a little debate about whether these were actually abandoned, because they did look like they were in pretty good condition. But when they walked a little bit closer, it became very clear that nature was reclaiming this land. The grass was up to their waists. There were vines growing up the side of the houses. There were cars still parked in driveways that were totally rusted out, with grass growing all through them. And so they knew these were definitely abandoned. They walked up to the first house they saw, and they looked in a window. And they couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was like whoever lived here had left without taking anything. The house was still totally furnished. In fact, their dining room table still had plates and cups and forks and knives on it, like they had just finished dinner and then just got up and left. They started talking about going into these houses and looking around inside, but they started wondering, is this a museum? Is that why everything is in such good repair? Should we not go inside these houses? And they started looking around for any indication that this was not a museum, that these were just plain abandoned. And across the street from the house they were at was this totally decrepit-looking house. They decided to go over there and look in that one. So they looked in a window, and very clearly the ceiling was totally sagging down, and the first floor was buckling completely. And there were clothes and shoes scattered everywhere. And so for them, this was confirmation. This is no museum. These are abandoned. We can totally go look around inside. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids explored all the houses that looked structurally sound, that weren't going to collapse on them. And it was just fascinating. There was all this stuff that was left behind that was fairly valuable, and they didn't take anything. They just thought it was very cool. And after a while, they decided they had seen enough, and they turned around and headed back to their cabin. After they got back, they told their parents about what they'd found. And their father was like, "Man, that sounds awesome. I want to go check that out." And so that day, they went right back over to the abandoned houses. The first house they showed him was the really decrepit-looking one, where the ceiling was sagging and there were women's shoes and clothes all over the ground, to show him for sure these are abandoned, because we had some doubts at first too. These were definitely abandoned. So they looked at that house, and then they went back to the very first house they saw when they walked into this complex, the one that was in great condition and had the dining table still set. So they went inside, and they went upstairs. And they found this bedroom that, like everything else in the house, was totally intact. You had pictures on the wall, it was fully furnished, there were even still sheets made on the bed, and the pillow had a head imprint from whoever was there last. And at the foot of the bed was this beautiful fur coat. The father walked over to it, and he looked at it. And he's like, "This is real fur. This is a really expensive coat. I want to take this for our family." But before he took it, he had a hesitation. Is this really abandoned? If someone had been here, they would have seen footprints all over the house because there was a layer of grime all over the ground. And they could clearly see their own footprints from where they had just come in. And he's like, "No, this is just a weird situation. It's definitely abandoned. Finders keepers." And so he picked up the jacket and he said, "I'm going to give this to Mom after I clean it up." With the jacket in hand, the father and the kids explored the rest of the house. And when they went outside, they realized it was starting to get late and it was probably time to head back. And so they turned around and they started walking away from these houses towards their cabin. They got about 50 or 60 meters away when one of the kids said he just had this weird sense that they were being watched. And so he turned around and he was shocked when he saw there was an old woman standing in the bedroom that they had just been in where the fur coat was. She had a loose bun on the top of her head, she had this blue shawl on her shoulders over a cream blouse, and she was glaring at them. When the kid saw this woman, he made an audible gasp, and the rest of the group turned around too and saw this woman in the window. And the feeling was instant guilt. They're like, "Oh my goodness, we just stole from this poor woman who lives in this abandoned house." And so right away, the whole group started walking right back towards the house. They were going to give this jacket back. In fact, the dad was saying, "I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have taken this, I'm sorry." And as they were walking back towards the property, the woman in the window, who hadn't said anything, just turned around and walked back into the main part of the house so they couldn't see her anymore. So as they were walking closer to the house, they were assuming she was going to come downstairs to retrieve this jacket that they've taken from her. And so they got right up to the front door, and the father was yelling to her, "I'm sorry, where do you want me to leave this jacket? I can bring it into you." And they're kind of just waiting for her to come downstairs. And she doesn't. She's nowhere to be found. She's not making any sound. She's not indicating what to do. And so after waiting for a couple of minutes, the kids didn't really know what to do, and they were kind of getting uneasy about the situation. But the father was still very confident that he just wanted to give this back and make amends, make peace with her, say he was sorry. And so he walked inside. He told his kids, "Stay here, I'm going to go give it to her." And he went inside and he disappeared upstairs. And then all of a sudden, from across the street, in that decrepit house with the caved-in ceiling, they heard one of the second-floor windows come slamming down. And at the same time, their dad came charging down the stairs, no jacket with him, and he's saying, "Go, go, go." And the kids were spooked from the window getting slammed, and they started running away until they were about 100 meters away from these houses. And they stopped, and they were panting, and they were out of breath. And the kids asked their dad what happened. And he said to them, "I looked everywhere upstairs, and I could not find that lady. I don't know where she is. Either she's hiding from us or something. But I happened to be looking out at that other house, and something caught my eye. There was movement. And I saw another person in the second floor of that building that's falling apart. And I watched them slam the window. And then as soon as they did, I heard someone yell, 'Get out!' And I ran out after you guys." Now the kids and the dad were absolutely terrified, and they wanted to leave. But they also wanted one more look at these buildings before they did. And when they had run away, they had stopped behind this big group of trees that obscured their view of the buildings. They were out of sight. And so they began to peek their heads around the tree until they could see the building. And they couldn't believe what they saw. Standing in the window of the fur coat room was not only the old woman, but also a very tall man who was holding her shoulders and was bending down because his head was too high to look while standing. He was crouched down, and he was looking out the window next to her. And they were both glaring towards them. The father and his kids were practically falling over themselves to sprint away and back to their cabin. To this day, that family has no idea who those people were, what they were doing there, how they were able to move around without making any noise, and consistently hide from them and not leave any footprints. It was all very strange and terrifying stuff. And then the government ended up demolishing those houses almost immediately after they were there. And so they'll never get any answers, because everything's gone. What's really disturbing about tonight's stories isn't just the laughter outside the tent, or the hand reaching into the darkness, or the people staring through the windows of an abandoned house. It's the fact that in every single story, someone was watching them long before they realized it. Deep in the woods, there's this strange feeling people talk about sometimes, that sudden instinct telling you that you're not alone. Maybe those instincts exist for a reason. Until next time. See ya.